Hello, everyone. Omnisensei here with What If Dexter Had a Rival? Part 2. If you enjoy this content, please smash the like button. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Part 2, Chapter 16 to 35. Alejandro finally stopped shaking his legs and looked at the two people sitting in front of him. Of course I know her. That girl's mother told us you were good friends. Is that true? Alejandro nodded, not wanting to say much, and replied, yes, we've been going to the same school since first grade, and we've even shared classes. I could even say we were in preschool together. Is it the same for them? Sergeant Dokes looked at the other students nearby. Alejandro nodded again. What do your parents do for a living? My father is the manager of the Miami Urban Construction Department, and my mother is an accountant for his group. Alejandro shifted in his seat, appearing a bit more confident in his words. But as soon as he looked at Larry, his expression changed to one of fear. Is she dead? Larry nodded, keeping his gaze fixed on Alejandro, who avoided eye contact. Yes, she died tragically. She was unrecognizable. Her parents had to resort to a DNA test to determine if it was Greta Meyer. That's why we need your help. Out of all Greta's close friends, we need to find the killer as soon as possible. Alejandro bit his lip in frustration, his eyes slightly red. The next question is important. Try to remember well so you can give me a precise answer. But at that moment, Larry paused the interrogation. I have a question just for you, Alejandro. Did you know if Miss Greta Meyer had a boyfriend? Alejandro clenched his fists inside his pants pockets and said, I don't know. You don't know, or you don't want to admit that she liked someone else. Annoyed, Alejandro instantly looked up at Larry and let out a slight sigh, knowing that anything he said could damage his standing with these detectives. She really liked expressing how she felt. Larry reflected on Alejandro's words. They seemed to answer the question, but his explanation was not precise at all. That's why Larry looked at Sergeant Dokes, who then asked, are you saying that she was in love with someone and expressed it openly? In that case, was she in love with your friend Nicholas? Alejandro felt annoyed to admit it, but now that the detectives had brought it up, he had no choice but to tell them everything he knew about her. Now, with his hands on the table, he whispered, yes, she was in love with Nicholas. She worked hard to get his attention, even lost weight so he would notice her. Does Nicholas have a girlfriend? Yes. Larry handed Alejandro a glass of water. The gesture of reaching out to accept it showed that he no longer wanted to hide the truth, which was a good sign. It's Camila, isn't it? Alejandro froze for a moment and looked at Larry. Yes, but how did you know? Have you already investigated everything we were going to tell you? Sergeant Dokes shook his head, and Larry continued, yesterday afternoon, Nicholas took Camila to the Forensic Identification Center. They were traveling in a very expensive car, and no chauffeurs. But what intrigues me is how your teacher, Dave, who is usually very reserved, let two of his students leave so easily. Alejandro furrowed his brows, made a scornful face, and looked at Professor Dave with disdain. It's no secret that Nicholas' father funds the school. Even the gifts he gives to the most dedicated teachers are extremely enticing to all of them. In this school, Nicholas is like a king who must not be touched. We're making good progress, Alejandro. Now tell us, what does his father do for a living? He owns a large insurance company. Sergeant Dokes was surprised by this new information. So, from what you're saying, Nicholas must be very popular among the girls at this high school. Alejandro nodded, and Larry continued asking, in your opinion, who at your school could be bad enough to harm her or have a bad relationship with her? That's a very broad question. All the girls at school are jealous of her? After all, she and Nicholas are desk mates. They've thrown water balloons at her in the bathroom and poured ink on her while she walked through the hallways. Even though she never complained about the harassment she faced when she was alone, I know it was all because of Nicholas. In this school, all the girls have unrealistic princess dreams. But I think one of the most hypocritical relationships she had was with Camila. Her friend Camila. Yes. Sergeant Dokes was losing his patience. Without solid evidence, this case would be impossible to solve. Alejandro, did you like Greta too? The sudden change in James left Alejandro slightly stunned, but he still nodded. I confuse the love of friendship with that of a closer relationship, like romance. I always doubted whether it was real love or if I simply enjoyed being with her as a friend. You need a psychologist to clarify those doubts in your head. I'll recommend you see one, Larry said, setting aside the interrogation. That's not necessary. I'll be fine, Alejandro responded with full awareness, and his answers were mature. Perhaps kids nowadays are very mature. After all, these kinds of news and information are shown on TV daily. Larry felt that although Alejandro wanted to hide his feelings for Greta, what he had just said was true. Alejandro's honesty was genuine. He truly didn't know what he felt for Greta, and that feeling could easily be confused when one hasn't experienced true love. Finally, Larry suddenly asked, "Where were you between 5 p.m. on January 1st and midnight on January 2nd? Alejandro thought for a moment. "I was home the whole time. My parents can verify that information." Larry nodded with a kinder expression. "All right. We'll check on that later. You can go back to class." Sergeant Dokes, knowing the questioning was over, looked at Professor Dave so he could take the student away. "Well, that's all. If we need anything in the future, we'll get in touch with you." Alejandro stood up, put his hands back into his pants pockets, turned around, took 2 steps, and then looked back. "Can I go see her?" Larry shook his head. "Wait until the case is closed and she's buried. Then you can visit her at the cemetery." Alejandro turned and left without stopping, but his posture looked very sad. Even though there was no substantial progress in this conversation with Alejandro, they still managed to learn more about the relationship between the 5 students and rule Alejandro out as a suspect. The 2 detectives returned to the large office of the Academic Affairs Department and saw that Angel had already spoken with another student. "Got anything?" "No, nothing." "All right, let's call in the other 2. Let me handle the girl named Camila." Angel nodded. After all, there was no need for interference. So far, all the conversations were being recorded in both audio and video, so Larry could review them later if he had any doubts. At that moment, Camila entered without showing any shyness or fear. She walked directly to the empty seat in front of Larry and sat down. Sergeant Dokes, though surprised, asked in a firm tone, "Name?" "I'm Camila." "What is your relationship with Greta Maya?" "We're classmates." "Where were you between 5 p.m. on January 1st and midnight on January 2nd? Larry looked at the information in his personal notebook and sighed with some fatigue. He had found little from his first interview. Alejandro was a boy who maintained a close friendship with Greta Maya, the victim of a violent murder. During the interview, he presented himself as reserved and reluctant to share details about his relationship with Greta, though he did not display signs of extreme anxiety or the evasive behavior typical of someone with guilt. At first, Alejandro was closed off and uncooperative, which could be interpreted as a defensive attitude in response to adult scrutiny. However, his behavior changed significantly when Larry actively participated in the interrogation. At that moment, his body language and facial expressions reflected surprise and a sudden need to communicate, indicating that his previous silence did not stem from a desire to hide his own involvement but rather from the emotional pressure he felt regarding the situation and external judgment. In conclusion, Larry discovered that this boy did not exhibit signs of latent aggression or psychopathic traits linking him directly to the crime. His primary conflict seemed to stem from the influence of adults and their interpretations of his friendship with Greta. His distant attitude was not a strategy for concealment but a typical reaction of a minor who felt misunderstood or judged. Wanting a closer connection to the case, Larry decided to interrogate Camila, who was Nicholas's girlfriend and was likely at the center of everything.
Where were you between 5 p.m. on January 1st and midnight on January 2nd?
Camila's eyes instantly widened, and she glared at the two adults in front of her with anger.
Are you asking me this because you suspect me? If I were the murderer, do you think I'd be crazy enough to try and find out if she was the girl they found?
Sergeant Dokes was tired of being treated like garbage by students, so this time, with an unfriendly look, he slammed the table hard. Answer the question and stop talking nonsense. I must remind you that we are only investigating the cause of Greta Meyer's death, so we expect your cooperation. This time, Larry had to intervene in the initial interrogation and said, according to both adults and classmates, you and Greta had a good friendship. If you were truly her friend, don't you want to help the police catch the killer? Camila was upset, frustrated, and not in the mood to feel the compassion of adults who didn't actually care about her friend's death. I went home at the usual time. My father picked me up around 3. I didn't leave the house after I got back. If you've done your research properly, you'll see that I didn't stay for the New Year's activities our high school always holds. But that day, I wasn't feeling well from something I ate, so I went home earlier than planned. Can your father confirm that? Camila, who had barely been holding back her emotions, broke down instantly. She stood up and slammed her left hand on the table. Greta and I were good friends, even if others don't think so. Now she's dead. When she was alive, she never cared about what others said about our relationship. She always valued my friendship more because it was genuine and not fake like everyone else's. Larry assessed Camila, first looking directly into her eyes and then lowering his gaze to her hands. Sit down. Sergeant Dokes, who had little patience, snapped at the girl, who seemed oblivious to the gravity of the situation. You say you went home earlier than planned because you weren't feeling well. Can anyone else in your house confirm that you were actually there all night? Larry began pressing Camila, looking for inconsistencies in her alibi without outright accusing her. Now we're interested in why you're so upset. Once Camila sat down again, Larry continued, you said Greta didn't care about the rumors regarding your friendship. Does that mean there were people who doubted your relationship? Camila, who was beginning to cry, murmured, we had our arguments. I gave her advice she didn't want to hear, and that annoyed her. When was the last time you spoke to Greta? Did you fight again? We just argued about the same things. Are you Nicholas's girlfriend? Yes. Did you know that Greta also liked Nicholas? If you were friends, she probably never would have expressed her feelings so openly. I'm almost certain she didn't know you were dating Nicholas, but the others did. Don't you think it was cruel not to tell her? Camila lifted her head, looked at Larry, and through clenched teeth asked, does that have anything to do with the case? Answer the question. I never told her. I didn't want to hurt her feelings. Beside them, Professor Dave kept his stern gaze fixed on Camila. After all, she was speaking with a lot of aggression, and seeing that the two officers weren't being too hard on her, he chose to remain silent. After finishing the interrogation, Nicholas emerged from the adjacent room as soon as he left the office. Camila acted as if she were weak and walked toward him. The dominant attitude she had displayed vanished completely, and the two walked toward the classroom side by side. Sergeant Dokes felt a chill run down his spine and spoke in a low voice, something is happening right in front of us, and I have no idea what it is. Don't talk about this here. The teachers would do everything in their power to prevent us from continuing the investigation if they think the murderer is one of their students. I'll handle the rest. Angel, who had just finished interrogating the other two children, looked at Larry and nodded. They had to compare the entry and exit times of all the individuals with the transcripts. The truth was, it was an incredibly arduous task. Larry's phone vibrated. He took it out and saw that the test results had been sent by Dexter, who was responsible for analyzing the blood. All the bloodstains on the murder weapon belonged to the deceased. The more than 300 bloodstained sand samples they had provided also belonged to Greta. No second DNA was found on any of the clothing, knives, nails, etc. that had been sent for inspection. Larry, also quite puzzled, forwarded the results to Sergeant Dokes. After reading them, he nodded and continued reviewing the surveillance footage. At that moment, Larry seized the opportunity to take note of Nicholas's statement, in which he had openly denied his relationship with Camila when interrogated by Angel. They surely always kept it a secret. Their circle of friends would fall apart if they knew the two of them were dating. Angel suggested what might have happened within that group of 5 friends. Something didn't add up. Larry kept thinking, always feeling like something was missing, but he couldn't grasp that fleeting spark of inspiration. He continued pondering Nicholas and the other 5 people, and all the conflicts between them spiraled into a vicious cycle. As they had lunch, Larry analyzed all the answers the other 2 students had given to Angel's questions during the interrogation. They didn't have much time. It would have been ideal for Larry to question all those students, but even they couldn't apply too much pressure, or they would be accused of overstepping their authority with minors. Even if they proved otherwise, it would still delay the investigation. I have to check. At that moment, Larry called the pathology department. His request was simple. He wanted Greta's body to be thawed because he planned to perform another autopsy the next day. Since there was no concrete evidence yet, Larry had to see if anything had been overlooked. But at that moment, even for someone like him, who rarely slept, exhaustion was setting in. So, he went home to rest. At 5:25 a.m. on January 4, 2006, just after waking up, Larry received a call from Sergeant Dokes. All traces of sleep vanished instantly, and Larry quickly pressed the answer button. What happened? Forensic Dr. Luke, please come to the high school immediately. A student has been found dead. Larry sat up abruptly, his drowsiness disappeared in an instant. A girl? Yes, the victim is Camila Wells. Sergeant Dokes' voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't rested all night. Larry hung up, jumped out of bed, changed clothes, and rushed out. Driving his car, he sped towards the high school gate, where the police had already set up a perimeter. On the other side of the street, another vehicle came to a stop, and Angel hurried out. When Angel saw Larry, he ran over to help him with his equipment. The security guard, who had seen them both the day before, was terrified when he heard that someone had died. But this time, there was no stopping them as they headed straight for the dormitory area. Not far from the entrance, an auxiliary police officer was already waiting to guide them to the scene. They passed by the school cafeteria and the library before reaching the rear area, a dense pine forest. The trees were so tall that they completely blocked out the sunlight. As a result, the ground was covered with only pine needles and dead leaves, with not a single blade of grass on the hard soil. A low, hollow wall, stretching several hundred meters, separated the forest from the residential area. Sergeant Dokes, who was already at the scene, saw them approaching and rushed toward them. "I'm on my way." Larry nodded from a distance. "This confirms one thing. The killer is definitely in the school," Larry stated while putting on his investigation suit, gloves, and a mask. "At 5 o'clock this morning, we received a call from the high school's night security guard. He said that when he got up to patrol as usual, he saw a flashing light in the forest, so he ran to check it out. The guard feared there might be mischievous students, so he inspected the area. After all, a student had died 2 days ago, so this was part of the school's protocol. But when he circled the forest, he saw no one. However, when he reached this spot, he found a girl in a white school uniform sitting right there," Sergeant Dokes said, pointing to the cordoned-off area. The guard approached, checked on the student, and when he realized she was dead, he immediately called the police. "I wasn't expecting this." Angel had thought that Camila was the best candidate to be the prime suspect in the murder. Not only had she lied about being Nicholas' girlfriend, but her relationship with the victim was uncertain. "I knew we had to insist on interrogating those students one by one." Larry was irritated by cases where children were involved, whether as victims or criminals. there were far more restrictions compared to cases involving adults. By the time Larry stopped thinking about the details, the three of them had already crossed the forest and soon arrived at the crime scene, near the path on the other side. Counting the steps, it was about 50 meters away. The light seen from this distance had to be either a flashlight or the flash of a phone. At that moment, the sun was beginning to rise, so visibility was becoming clearer. Camila was kneeling in front of a towering tree, her arms wrapped around it in a forced and unnatural gesture. Her wrists were tightly bound to the rough bark with a shoelace, her skin reddened from the pressure. Around her, the ground was covered with dry pine needles and dead branches, carefully arranged behind her, as if someone had tried to hide something or stage a macabre scene. The discovery of the shoelace sparked a wave of enthusiasm among the investigators. If the killer hadn't used gloves, their DNA might be embedded in the fibers, offering a crucial lead to track them down. Once again, in the woods. The ground was a mix of dead leaves and hardened soil, an ideal surface for leaving no footprints. There were no drag marks or signs of a struggle, suggesting that the victim had likely been restrained elsewhere before being placed here. The killer had chosen the site with precision. Not only was it an area rarely traveled, but the arrangement of the dead branches behind the body suggested a crude, perhaps rushed, attempt at concealment. However, rather than covering up the crime, it seemed more like a message or a signature. This was no random murder, every detail had been intentional. If the school hadn't intensified its patrols, the body could have remained undiscovered for hours, maybe even days. That raised a disturbing possibility. Had the killer been waiting for someone to find her much later than now? Angel lifted the police tape, allowing Larry to examine the scene in detail. Their communication was swift, almost instinctive. Each case seemed to strengthen their ability to interpret the hidden patterns behind every crime. Larry slowly approached Camila, never taking his eyes off her lifeless body. To be honest, the conversation from the previous day was still lingering in his mind. There was something about it that had never fully convinced him, a subtle contradiction in the way she spoke. But he had never imagined that today, he would find her as a corpse. Her head rested lightly against the tree trunk, her medium-length hair falling forward, partially hiding her face. She was wearing her school uniform, a short-sleeved white blouse and a navy blue skirt with two thin white lines along the hem. At first glance, the scene almost seemed harmless, as if she wasn't actually dead. That explained the confusion of the night guard and why he had touched her. Camila was kneeling before the tree, her feet pointing backward and her knees bent in an M shape, an oddly orderly position for a lifeless body. If it weren't for the context, anyone might have thought she had simply fallen asleep. To the side, her shoes lay neatly placed side by side, as if they had been removed deliberately. The soles of her now bare feet were covered in a fine layer of dust, a detail that suggested she had walked barefoot before dying, or that someone had moved her. Larry slightly adjusted his position before reaching out and brushing aside the hair covering Camila's face. As soon as his eyes landed on her expression, a chill ran down his spine. The girl's eyes were wide open, frozen in a gaze of sheer terror. Her mouth, slightly ajar, seemed to want to release one last scream that never came. There was no doubt, in her final moments, Camila had been fully aware of what was happening. Larry took a deep breath and thought, with an expression like that, she wasn't just killed, she was caught off guard. It was a quick, unexpected murder. Only from this angle did Larry notice another crucial detail: a cord, similar to the one binding her wrists, was wrapped around her neck. But the most chilling part wasn't the cord itself, it was the way the ends had been meticulously tied into a precise knot. Larry narrowed his eyes as he recalled something. He had seen that same pattern before. The knots were identical to those used in the case of Greta Meyer on January 2nd. The same technique. The same precision. This was no coincidence. As Larry reached out to place the measuring ruler over the body, Angel, who had taken Max's place after his emotional collapse, leaned in and snapped a photograph of the mark on Camila's neck. The impression was deep and clear, a silent testament to the force with which she had been strangled. The entire mark around her neck formed a circular pattern, with 3 or 4 deep grooves embedded in the skin. However, the most pronounced one had a semicircular shape, with a slight elevation at the back of her neck. Larry examined the mark closely. The distribution of the grooves left no doubt. The killer had strangled Camila initially, then repeated the process, as if they needed to make absolutely sure she was dead. This wasn't an impulsive act, it was methodical. There was another detail that was even more telling. This type of strangulation, with repeated pressure, was characteristic of crimes committed by someone close to the victim. Someone who didn't just want to kill her, but wanted to silence her. Camila's hair, carefully spread over her face, reinforced that theory. It wasn't just a careless oversight by the killer, it seemed like a deliberate attempt to conceal her expression. The marks on her neck were all horizontal, a clear indication that the pressure applied had been consistent and sustained. The skin around the grooves was leathery and dark purple, unmistakable signs of prolonged pressure. Fortunately, the body had been discovered quickly, preventing more evident signs of livor mortis from developing. Larry moved to examine Camila's hand and observed the bindings around her wrists. The cords had cut deep into her skin, leaving raw, reddened gashes. However, what caught his attention the most were her clenched fists, tightly shut. His pupils contracted in understanding. Something didn't add up. Victims of mechanical asphyxiation usually try to grab onto anything as an instinctive act of survival, the object strangling them, their own clothes, or even thin air. But Camila didn't. Her fists were closed with an unusual rigidity. She wasn't grabbing something out of instinct. She was holding onto something. Or maybe resisting until the very end. Almost instinctively, Larry extended Camila's rigid fingers. Her joints were tense, as if she had been clutching something in her final moments. A small fragment of white leather, vaguely shaped like the letter B, fell from her palm. Larry's normally calm demeanor tensed. Without wasting any time, he picked it up with extreme care and placed it in an evidence bag. Then, with the precision of experience, he meticulously clipped Camila's nails to send them for analysis. If there were any traces of the attacker, they could be found there. As he stood up, an unsettling sensation hit him. That piece of leather, he had seen it before. He tried to search his memory, going over old crime scenes, past cases, and forensic reports. But the exact image slipped through his mind like sand through his fingers. Angel, contact someone to transport the body to the center. There was nothing else to examine here. This crime scene wasn't as brutal as before, which gave Larry more freedom to think things through at the center. At that moment, firm footsteps approached from behind. Sergeant Doak stopped beside him, observing him with his characteristic seriousness. "Is everything okay? What did you find?" Larry let out a sigh and looked at Camila's body again. Mechanical asphyxiation. It's undoubtedly a homicide. The death occurred within the last 2 hours. Doakes frowned, waiting for more details. Judging by the time the security guard reported the case, the light he saw must have been from the killer's phone. It's likely they were still here when they were discovered. After saying that, Larry paused and revealed his analysis. The killer could also be a woman. Camila wasn't particularly strong, but if her attacker had less physical strength, they would have needed to apply repeated pressure to ensure she was dead. That would explain the multiple grooves on the victim's neck. Doak slowly nodded and said, "That usually happens when the attacker fears the victim might survive. Excessive force due to insecurity." "Exactly," Larry confirmed and added, "but the rest of the details will depend on the autopsy and forensic analysis. In the meantime, we need to expand the scope of the investigation." The two men exchanged a look. 2 students murdered in a short period of time. The pattern was clear. Time was running out. And if they didn't catch the killer soon, there would be a third victim. Of course. I'll stay at the school and take care of the investigation. Also, I think we can link this case to Greta Myers. Larry didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he trusted his research, so he said, "Judging by the way the knots were tied and the choice of the crime scene, the killer is the same." Angel, who had been inspecting the surroundings, rushed back with an evidence bag in hand. "I found this lighter and a leather buckle about 20 meters away. I don't know if they're related to the case, but it's worth analyzing them." Sergeant Dokes, eager for any clue that could help close the case, nodded firmly. This time, he hoped the evidence would be enough to catch the murderer. Without wasting any more time, Larry and Angel got into the car and quickly returned to the investigation center. As soon as they parked, they saw Masuka and Max waiting at the entrance, both with tense expressions. As soon as they got out of the car, Masuka rushed toward them. "We have a problem." After signing the body's transfer, Camila's parents arrived, and they're making a huge scene. Angel frowned. "What happened?" "They say they won't allow the autopsy. This happened all the time, and Masuka understood it. They're causing an uproar inside the center." Camila's mother even scratched one of the criminal investigation agents when he tried to talk to them. "What?" "She attacked a cop." Angel's eyes widened in disbelief. As soon as they stepped inside, the scene before them was shocking. In the middle of the hallway, a woman with shoulder-length hair was sobbing uncontrollably, desperately hugging the body bag outside the morgue. Beside her, a middle-aged man, his face twisted with anger and pain, was furiously punching one of the criminal agents. "Don't touch my daughter. You have no right." But his fury didn't last long. Within seconds, several auxiliary officers who had rushed in after hearing the commotion ran toward him and pinned him to the ground. The woman's screams grew louder. The tension in the room was suffocating. How did they get here, and who informed them? Probably that security guard who found Camila. Angel was furious. Why did they attack the police? Do they realize Camila was murdered? This is a criminal case, and it's not something they can control. An autopsy is a necessary measure. Don't they want to find the killer? Camila's mother, Lisa, became enraged. "Don't try to reason with me. I won't give you the right to touch my daughter." Larry stopped Angel, who was about to step forward. "There's no need to explain. Just take her to a cell for obstructing an official investigation." If they had been good parents, they would have paid much more attention to where their daughter was late at night. She's dead now, accept it. Even if she wants to use her status as a woman to cause trouble, she won't do it now. While Lisa was distracted by the commotion, several security guards from the center took advantage of the moment to quickly push the body bag into the autopsy room, closing the doors behind them before Camila's parents could react. Larry, Masuka, and Max walked together toward the locker room, with Angel following closely behind, accompanying the injured officer. Once inside, they quickly and efficiently cleaned and bandaged the wound. Larry barely paid attention to the procedure. His mind was processing every detail of the case. When they finished, he lifted his gaze toward the injured officer and spoke firmly. "Notify your sergeant, Dokes. I want you to investigate the relationship between this couple and Nicholas's parents." But at that moment, Larry paused, as if a thought had just taken shape in his mind. "Wait. Since we've investigated these families, let's investigate them all, thoroughly and without oversight." The room fell into a heavy silence. Masuka and Max exchanged glances. "Also," Larry said coldly, "we need to verify each person's alibi individually, minute by minute." He turned to Angel with a somber expression. "I have a feeling the killer is right in front of us." The weight of his words fell upon the team like a heavy stone. No one dared to argue. After completing the necessary paperwork and informing Lieutenant Lagerter of what they needed, Angel quickly returned to find out what they were dealing with in this case. Recently, Larry had influenced their way of investigating, and Angel had developed a great interest in anatomy. The way a criminal profiler like Larry viewed things taught him a lot about improving his own approach to work. Masuka, who had arrived early and was the one who called the young Max to participate in the autopsy this time, opened the body bag. But at that moment, the young forensic aspirant let out a scream. "Oh my God! Her eyes are still open, damn it!" Masuka approached Max and lightly patted his shoulder as he advised him, "Hey, kid, don't get so scared. Haven't you heard that people can die with their eyes open? If you can't handle something like this, you still have time to consider other ways to make a living in the future." They told me that, over time, I'd get used to it, that the smell, the stiffness, the absence would stop affecting me. But what if I don't want to get used to it? What if doing so makes me lose part of what makes me human? Max, still a student, had his doubts. Well, that's normal. Sometimes, I wonder if this was the path I was meant to take. I see cold bodies on the table, examine their wounds, read their stories. But where is the life in all this? Where is my humanity? Over time, you'll realize that if you're not willing to sacrifice a piece of your soul and learn to live with it, then you should look for other alternatives. Masuka's words rang true. Forensic experts had to sell a part of their soul for the greater good. Larry looked at Max, then at Camila, whose eyes remained open. In this case, the eyelid is surrounded by the orbicularis oculi muscle. After death, all muscles relax. As rigor mortis sets in, the eyelids slightly open. But it's rare to see someone with their eyes as wide open as Camila's. It's unlikely, but it happened this time. I suspect her expression at the moment of death reveals something important about her state at that time, Larry said, examining the body carefully. Angel, not entirely focused on Larry's work, took the opportunity to search one of the forensic computers, reviewing any preliminary reports that might provide more clues. Are you saying that her eyes remained wide open, frozen in an expression of extreme fear? As if she had seen something terrifying right before she died? Max asked, furrowing his brows, unable to stop his hands from trembling. Larry nodded gravely. Exactly. That expression suggests she saw her death coming. It wasn't a surprise attack. There was another disturbing detail. The killer had let Camila's hair fall over her face, covering her eyes in what seemed like a deliberate gesture. If the crime was committed by someone who knew her, this could indicate a sense of guilt. Larry murmured, analyzing the photographs taken before Camila was removed from the crime scene. He didn't want to look at her after what he did. The three proceeded with the forensic protocol, carefully removing Camila's clothing and placing it in order on a nearby table. Every garment, meticulously folded, could contain crucial traces, fibers, biological residues, maybe even fingerprints. The scene had to be analyzed in the greatest detail. The killer had left a signature. They just needed to learn how to read it. What a shame. This girl had a future ahead of her, Masuka muttered, clicking his tongue with a hint of sorrow he could only share slightly with his colleagues. Larry didn't respond. He ignored the forensic examiner's words and focused on the autopsy. There were too many unanswered questions, and every detail could be crucial. On the front of Camila's short-sleeved school uniform, fragments of tree bark were found adhered to the fabric, as if she had been dragged or pressed against the trunk at some point before her death. The cause of death was clear: mechanical asphyxia. The body showed the characteristic signs of this type of death. As in many strangulation cases, the loss of control over the sphincters had caused the victim to excrete urine and feces, soiling her clothes. An uncomfortable detail, but crucial in determining the sequence of events. Larry and his team proceeded with surgical precision. They removed the shoelaces that had been used as strangulation tools, tied around Camila's wrists and neck. Each knot was documented with photographs before being carefully bagged as evidence. Larry pointed at one of the knots with his finger, his expression hardening. "Look at this, do you see it? It's the same type of knot we found on Greta's wrist when she died." Masuka frowned, squinting as he processed the information. "So, do we have a pattern?" Larry nodded slowly. If the killer repeated the same methods, there might be more victims. And if they understood his technique, they could start profiling him. "Are you concluding that Greta Meyer and Camila Wells were murdered by the same person just because of the knot?" Masuka asked skeptically. Larry kept his eyes fixed on the evidence before responding calmly, the knot is just part of the reason. But there's more, the choice of crime scene, the method used, and, above all, the way the killer repeatedly checked whether the victim was dead. Everything points to the same pattern. Max, who had remained silent until then, clenched his fists and asked, "But there's a big difference. Greta Meyer died from hemorrhagic shock, while Camila was strangled." Larry looked at both men with composure and asked, "Do you remember the knife embedded in Greta Meyer's perineum?" Masuka and Max nodded, recalling the scene with discomfort. The killer didn't do it just out of hatred or sadism. Larry paused before continuing. He had another purpose. He wanted to make sure Greta was really dead. There was a tense silence before Larry resumed his work. "Max, send all the collected objects and samples from the scene for analysis." The killer didn't have time to clean up. If he didn't wear gloves, we might find traces of his DNA on the shoelaces. Max nodded and took notes. "Remind Dexter to compare the DNA with the samples taken from yesterday's suspects," Larry added while jotting things down in his personal notebook. Without wasting time, Max left the room to send the samples to the lab. Now, it was just a matter of waiting. The autopsy revealed unmistakable signs of strangulation. Camila's face was swollen, with pinpoint hemorrhages on her skin and conjunctiva. Additionally, the typical loss of sphincter control had occurred, with urine and fecal discharge, common indicators in deaths caused by mechanical asphyxia. Larry opened the victim's neck, chest, and abdomen, examining each internal organ with precision. Fracture in the upper angle of the thyroid cartilage. Masuka murmured, observing the injury closely. The subcutaneous hemorrhage in the neck grooves was evident, with 4 deep dark brown marks. Clear signs of the pressure exerted during the strangulation. The internal organs displayed the typical effects of asphyxiation, congestion in the right atrium, right ventricle, liver, and kidneys. The lungs showed severe congestion with pronounced emphysema, along with petechial hemorrhages under the serous and mucous membranes. The blood, dark red in color and fluid in texture, confirmed respiratory collapse. Only small amounts of fibers and chyme were found in the stomach, indicating that death occurred more than 6 hours after the last meal. After measuring the rectal temperature of the body, Larry began calculating the time of death. "Do you remember the formula for determining the time elapsed since death based on body temperature?" Larry asked without looking at anyone. Masuka nodded, but Larry directed the question to his assistant. "Max, you answer it. You're studying, after all. We need to teach you the details." The young man nodded confidently and said, "The time elapsed since death is equal to 37 minus the rectal temperature of the body, divided by 0.33, multiplied by the coefficient." "And the coefficient?" "Name them all." Masuka joined in on the lesson being given to maximum 1 in spring and autumn, 1.4 in summer, and 0.7 in winter. Max responded without hesitation. After applying the formula, they determined that Camila's death occurred between 4:30 and 5:00 in the morning, within a margin of 4 hours. That means the light the security guard saw was emitted by the killer. Larry nodded, taking a swab to collect a sample from the victim. After sealing it in an evidence bag, he looked at Masuka and said, "There's an old laceration in the CN membrane. It needs to be sent for review." "This proves that your earlier judgment was correct," Masuka said, understanding Larry better. He always seemed to have the answers instantly, but since evidence was needed, he moved toward it until he found it. Camila's parents knew exactly what their daughter had done and didn't stop her. Larry nodded, a hint of sadness in his expression. The idea that money is everything has led young people today to be prematurely exposed to the dark side of society. Being born into a family, this was also Camila's pain, silent and suffocating. Larry carefully sutured the deceased's body, doing his best to keep it intact. Once again, this was the least he could do for the bodies that victims left behind. Upon returning to the office at 11 in the morning, Larry stared blankly at a photo of white leather on his computer screen. Max stood behind Larry, drinking water while perched on a stool, swinging his legs. Larry, you've been staring at this picture for half an hour. Can you tell me what information it contains?
It could be the key.
Maybe something feminine. Larry suddenly turned and stared at Angel, who had just said that. Something feminine? Yes, why hadn't he thought of it before? I know who the killer is. You figured it out.
But who was the killer?
Larry pointed at the white leather in the photo and said, Valeria, the shadow we didn't even consider. This is the ornament on her shoes that she wore the day of the interrogation.
Remember it, Angel, you questioned her.
But before Angel could be surprised, Dexter burst into the homicide office.
Are the results in yet?
Well, the test results just came in. Sergeant Dokes, slightly excited, handed them to Larry. They found a person's DNA on the shoelaces that strangled Camila and under her nails. You'll never guess who it is. The two men stared at Dexter and paused. Larry frowned, thinking for a moment. Why no reaction? Larry already has the answer. How about a bet? That's disturbing. Yeah, forget what I said. Max felt embarrassed by his suggestion and fell silent. It's Valeria, Greta Meyer's second friend in their group of 4. Dexter's eyes widened in surprise. It was unexpected. Larry's words were far more shocking than his own reaction to receiving the report. How did you figure it out? I just connected the patterns. Unexpectedly, a shadow like Valeria was the stain right in front of us, but one we hadn't noticed. Lieutenant Lagerta's office, Homicide Division. Lagerta reviewed the report with a stern expression. After reading Larry's statements, she looked up and asked firmly, Forensic Dr. Luke, are you completely sure about this? Yes, we all are, Larry replied without a shred of doubt in his investigation. The evidence on the table spoke for itself. Camila had died clutching a small piece of white leather in the shape of a bee, which turned out to be an ornament that had fallen off Valeria's shoes. Furthermore, the forensic analysis revealed traces of Valeria's DNA both on the laces used to strangle Camila and under her nails. The connection was undeniable. The autopsy results for Greta Meyer are not yet complete. Larry pointed at the report on the table and said, consider this a draft of the original report. I'll send you the final version as soon as it's ready. Lagerta nodded. The overwhelming evidence had dispelled any doubts about Larry's team's efficiency. All right, I'll issue an arrest warrant immediately. Larry narrowed his eyes, thoughtful. Catch her as soon as possible. I suspect she might try to take her own life. As they left the office, Angel, still pondering Larry's warning, finally asked, why do you think Valeria wants to kill herself? Larry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked toward the homicide office, paused, and looked at them both seriously. The crime scene for Greta Meyer was practically spotless, almost perfect. Every trace that could identify the killer was erased. But in Camila's case, there are too many loose ends. Why do you think that is? Angel and Masuka exchanged glances. Larry continued, confident in his reasoning. When Camila was killed, the security guard passing near the school forest startled the murderer. They didn't have time to manipulate the scene. On the other hand, with Greta Meyer, they chose an isolated location where almost no one passed by. They took their time, planned every detail, and, to top it off, a pack of wild dogs finished destroying the evidence. We're dealing with a meticulous mind. But what would someone like that do upon realizing their crime is about to be exposed? Angel stroked his chin, reflecting seriously. If I were in their place, maybe that would be the most logical path. Max frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. Are you saying she already knows she's been discovered and is planning to kill herself? That's way too extreme. For an ordinary person, yes, Larry admitted, agreeing with Max, but there was something Max wasn't considering. But for someone who has already killed 2 people with precision and cold-bloodedness, nothing is impossible. Let's go. Angel and Max exchanged a glance, trying to keep up with Larry's rapid reasoning.
"Where are we going?"
Max asked, still confused. "There's still missing evidence in Greta Meyer's case. The police must arrest the right person, but we have another matter to deal with," Larry said as he headed toward the morgue. "We need to perform a second autopsy on Greta Meyer. Last night, I requested that her body be thawed." Without further explanation, Larry moved ahead, leaving his colleagues with no choice but to follow him.
Again?
The three of them descended the stairs. Autopsy room number 2 was already prepared, and Greta Meyer's body had been completely thawed. Originally, the cadaveric lividity on her body had been prominent, but now, due to the freezing and thawing process, it had shifted. Curiously, most of the discoloration appeared on the right side of the body. During the first autopsy, Larry hadn't examined her back in detail because, at the time, her internal organs had been almost entirely exposed. For this second examination, he decided to start from behind. The two forensic specialists, fully equipped with gloves and protective gowns, positioned themselves on either side of the dissection table and worked together to turn the corpse. Meanwhile, Angel stood at a distance from the working area. Once the body was completely turned over, Max took a deep breath and pointed at a circular, bloodless mark in the middle of the back. "How is it possible that this mark appears now? It wasn't there during the first autopsy," Max exclaimed, very surprised by the changes. He stepped closer to examine it better. With the body lying face down on the stretcher, the visual impact was less intense. Larry took a cotton swab and began cleaning the mark, using up to 3 swabs to remove any residue. "Many marks can become more visible after the body has been frozen and thawed," Larry explained, knowing this could happen. The process accelerates decomposition and can make certain bruises or pre-existing injuries stand out more. "Do you know what this mark is?" Larry frowned and reviewed the findings from the first autopsy: no signs of cranial trauma, no strangulation marks on the neck, no drug residues in the blood. Only scratches had been found on the victim's palms and knees. That means the killer controlled her in another way. The murderer must have taken her by surprise, probably pushing her from behind to destabilize her. It's possible they used an inhaled anesthetic to knock her out. Although no traces were found in her blood, certain volatile compounds disappear over time or degrade during the freezing process. "Do you think they could have also immobilized her with their body?" Angel asked from the side. Larry nodded. "Yes. If they applied pressure with their knee on her back while tying her up, that would explain the circular mark we see here. We should also check for fractures or signs of internal bleeding in the rib area, which would indicate that significant force was applied." "Makes sense. Since Greta Meyer hadn't eaten in a day, it's logical she was physically weakened." Larry picked up a scalpel and prepared to examine the area in more detail. "We need more evidence. If this mark formed before her death, we might be one step closer to understanding exactly how she was murdered. Different types of evidence: DNA, fingerprints, cadaveric lividity, chemical traces, wound patterns, can either reinforce or contradict a conclusion. If multiple pieces of evidence point to the same outcome, the case becomes stronger. That's why, in a trial, a defense attorney will look for any inconsistency to discredit the investigation. The more evidence there is, the harder it is to refute. And that is how forensic specialists ensure that detectives' work isn't torn apart in court. Let's pray the killer wore a skirt or pants," Angel said as he watched Larry nearly finish his work. The comment, though sarcastic, reflected the team's uncertainty. They had no idea to whom the collected sample belonged. They couldn't even determine if it came from a man or a woman. The bean was immediately sent for analysis. Max grabbed a vial containing a cotton swab and hurried to inspect it meticulously. Meanwhile, Larry delved deeper into the wound, carefully separating the edges with surgical precision. A slight subcutaneous hemorrhage became visible, confirming his initial hypothesis: the injury had been inflicted before death. After a more thorough evaluation, he found no further relevant information in that area. Noticing that Larry was working alone, Angel approached to help him turn the body. With steady hands, Larry carefully removed the remaining tissue from the deceased's lips and examined it with a magnifying glass. Then, he focused on the teeth. He had already checked the oral cavity earlier, but now he had the feeling he had overlooked something. This time, he inspected each tooth meticulously. Suddenly, his gaze froze on a specific point. "Tweezers! I need tweezers!" Larry exclaimed with some urgency, forgetting that Angel was just a veteran detective and not a forensic expert. Angel reacted immediately and handed him the tool. He wasn't an expert, but after years of working with Masuka, he had learned a few things. Even so, his analytical skills were far from matching those of a criminal profiler like Larry. With extreme care, Larry pulled out a hair tangled in a blood clot, hidden in the deepest folds of Greta Meyer's upper jaw. After a moment, Larry precisely extracted the hair from the clot and, upon closer examination, let out a chuckle filled with satisfaction. Actually, it's a hair with its follicle intact. Just then, Mac entered the room with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. His gaze shifted from the evidence bag held by the burly man to Larry's triumphant expression. After a brief pause, he shrugged and commented with resignation, "Looks like I have another sample delivery to make." Miami Metropolitan Police Department, Homicide Division 1:30 p.m., January 3rd. After completing the second autopsy, they quickly grabbed a meal in the cafeteria to regain some energy. Just then, both Larry's and Max's phones rang simultaneously. Max checked his screen and, seeing the call was from the pathology department's landline, ran out with evident excitement. Meanwhile, Larry saw Captain Tom Matthews' name on his screen and answered immediately. "Forensic Dr. Luke, we've caught Valeria. Come at once." "Good," Larry replied, much calmer now. Wasting no time, he grabbed a stack of color-printed photographs and a police uniform jacket that had been resting on the table he had been using during these late-night investigations. "Let's go." As they left the office, Max had already run down the stairs from the second floor, carrying a pile of reports, and followed them without delay. Shortly after, the three arrived at the Homicide Division and headed up to the second-floor meeting room. As soon as they entered, Larry nodded in greeting to the captain. But before he could sit down, the captain quickly approached him and shook his hand enthusiastically. "The investigator assigned to the high school where the murder took place received my call and went to find the principal," the captain explained without preamble. "However, Valeria called in sick this morning and said she was going to the clinic for some medication. I ordered a search of nearby clinics, and we found her in a pharmacy north of the high school. When they caught her, she was with her mother, buying medicine." Larry exhaled in relief. The important thing was that they had found her. Valeria was an imminent danger. If she didn't kill someone else, she would end up taking her own life. "Did the tech detectives manage to crack Greta Meyer's computer?" Larry asked as he settled comfortably in the captain's office. The captain nodded seriously. "I was just about to tell you. The computer was hacked, but they managed to recover the sent messages. They also synchronized them with her mobile phone." "Are all 5 of them in the same group?" Larry interjected, analyzing the information in his mind. "Yes." Camila even suggested going to the beach to take pictures on Sunday, but the others were busy and couldn't go. Angel, who had remained silent until then, frowned and asked, "Have they verified where Camila was on the day Greta was murdered?" Larry immediately formulated a new hypothesis. Could it be that Greta Meyer was the person Camila had arranged to meet? A heavy silence settled in the room as everyone processed the possibility. Captain Matthews nodded at Angel's observation and explained, "You asked the right question, but we previously analyzed the students' group chats, and the content is interpreted in a much simpler way." Larry looked at the color-printed screenshots that the captain handed him. At first glance, the messages didn't seem to reveal anything significant. "Valeria, aren't you coming to the gathering?" "Greta, yes, I think so." "Camila, we can go to the woods so no adults bother us." "Alejandro, sure." "Nicholas, but it's raining." Valeria, I'll take a taxi. The rest of you can come later if you can. Greta, all right. There didn't seem to be anything alarming. But behind the apparent banality of these words lay a pattern that any detective could detect. The killer was within Greta Meyer's circle of friends. However, none of them admitted this fact or cooperated with the investigation. When they were called in to testify, they refused to cooperate, and their parents hired lawyers to obstruct the process. This delayed the investigation, but thanks to the intervention of the Meyer family, the police gained access to the messages, strengthening the case. "This is complete bullshit," a detective muttered before asking, "Was Camila trying to accuse Valeria before she died?" "It doesn't matter," Matthews interrupted dryly and pointed out, "Valeria is at the station right now. We arrested her under the pretext of questioning her about the chat, but we still need to solidify the case. Her family is downstairs, and the situation is delicate." The captain turned his gaze to Larry and then said, "Lieutenant Lagerta mentioned that you had solid evidence. Explain your progress to us." Everyone in the room fixed their eyes on him. Dokes even encouraged him, "We want to hear your reconstruction of the scene. This killer girl is hard to deal with." "Yeah, the bitch cried during interrogation and didn't say a word," Sergeant Dokes said with disdain. Lagerta, who fully trusted Larry, was more direct, "We don't have much evidence, and it's difficult to make a complete reconstruction. Larry, show us what you have." Larry frowned, took out several color-printed A4 documents, and spread them out on the table. "This is a photo of the crime scene. And this other photograph was taken by Angel when we went to the high school to look for clues about Greta Meyer's murder. One of the images showed Greta's body with multiple deep wounds, a clear sign of hatred. Another photo captured Camila's lifeless hand holding a small fragment of white leather shaped like a bee. By comparing details, we discovered that this fragment is identical to the decorative flowers on Valeria's shoes." After saying that, Larry continued, "A small find, but a revealing one, of course." The room remained silent. Larry proceeded with his analysis. Greta Meyer's wounds are brutal. Her killer tied her up, tortured her, and stabbed her repeatedly, making sure she suffered before dying. As for the 4 gashes on Camila's neck and the final stab wound in Greta's perineal area, they indicate that the killer had a deep resentment toward them, and an irrational fear that they would come back to life. A chill ran through the room. Larry moved on to the next piece of evidence. The killer meticulously planned the first victim's murder. They chose an isolated area in the forest park, wore gloves, anesthetized Greta, and attacked her by surprise. Even the wild dogs at the scene were part of the killer's plan. A murmur spread among those present. In contrast, Camila's murder seems to have been a crime of passion. Something that wasn't premeditated. We found Valeria's DNA on the shoelaces used to strangle Camila. We also found traces of Valeria's skin under her nails, indicating a struggle. The officers' faces reflected a mixture of disbelief and astonishment. Larry moved on to the final point. Besides the biological evidence, we found hay, dry branches, and lighters near Camila's body. I suspect Valeria attempted to burn the corpse to erase evidence, but the sudden appearance of a security guard forced her to flee. Larry delivered the final blow. This morning, we re-examined Greta's body. In her mouth, trapped in a blood clot, we found a hair. DNA analysis confirmed that it belongs to Valeria. We also identified a pressure mark on Greta's back. The killer pinned her down with a knee while tying her up, and the DNA on her skin matches Valeria's. Captain Matthews exhaled heavily. And the motive? Larry slid another sheet across the table. Everything points to Nicholas. Camila had a sexual relationship with him and believed they were a couple, but Nicholas denied it. This created tension in the group. Valeria, who probably had feelings for Nicholas, saw Camila as a threat. Greta, on the other hand, was the only one who knew the truth and, somehow, confronted Valeria that day in the woods during the gathering, where no one else but the two of them showed up. Larry crossed his arms. This wasn't an impulsive murder. Valeria planned Greta's death, and when Camila confronted her or discovered the truth, she killed her in a fit of fear, rage, and tension. The silence in the room was deafening. There were no doubts, Valeria was the murderer. Nicholas felt sympathy for Greta, and all his friends had always protected her. This detail, insignificant to many, awakened something dark in Valeria. Despite being part of the popular kids' circle, she had always gone unnoticed. Invisible. The frustration of not being noticed, of living in others' shadows, might have been the catalyst for her actions. Camila suspected her too late, and if Valeria felt threatened, she might have decided to silence her. "I'm done. This is all we need to catch that murderer, female murderer," Larry said as he pushed the detailed report toward Lieutenant Lagerta, who seemed to have been his strongest supporter. "By the way, has Valeria's family situation been verified?" The captain opened his work journal and reviewed his notes. "Verified. The day Greta Meyer was murdered was her grandmother's birthday. At first, I found it hard to believe that girl was the killer, but we have no records of her returning home that day." "What about the taxi?" "She took a taxi. Should we focus on that? If the taxi driver dropped her off near the first murder scene when she should have been at her grandmother's house, then there's nothing more to say." "We'll do that." The evidence was clear. There was no room for doubt. The captain slammed the table energetically. "We're interrogating her now. Larry, get ready. This time, you'll be leading the interrogation." "No, I'm not good with kids. Sergeant Dokes will get everything out of her." "Thanks for the compliment, Forensic, Luke." Sergeant Dokes took charge of the interrogation team. Meanwhile, Larry sank into a chair, closing his eyes for a moment. A sharp pain in his left eye made him dizzy. Discreetly, he took 2 sedatives. Angel watched him without saying a word. He simply stood up and poured him a glass of water. Larry accepted the gesture with gratitude. "Are you okay?" Angel asked after making sure no one was watching. Larry smiled wearily. "Just tension. Neuralgia. Nothing serious. If you're feeling better, come with us to listen to the interrogation." The 3 of them headed to the adjacent room. This time, the captain listened intently to the statement. The pressure on the municipal office was high due to the brutal consecutive murders. His tension eased as he saw how easily they obtained the confession. "I didn't expect it to be this easy. It looks like she's admitting to it." According to what she said, Valeria had scheduled a meeting with the group but changed the location at the last minute without informing Greta. Valeria took a taxi to pick up Greta under the pretense of going to the meeting site. Originally, everyone was supposed to go, but since the meeting was cancelled, no one else arrived. Larry observed what was happening in the interrogation room through the one-way mirror. An open backpack lay on the table. Among the scattered items, a bag of roasted peanuts and a bottle of mineral water stood out strangely. Larry narrowed his eyes and quickly approached the mirror. Valeria was no longer playing the role of the sweet girl. Her expression showed relief, with a hint of contempt in her smile. Something was wrong. Her change in attitude was abrupt. "In the end, I could have escaped when Camila stopped moving. I gathered pine needles and branches to burn her. But the security guard saw my flashlight. I hid behind a low wall, but the guard found the body and called the police. That's all." Valeria leaned back in her chair. Her face appeared calm, but her breathing was uneven. Her eyelids and cheeks were swollen as if she had been crying. Larry suddenly understood what was happening. "Where is her family?" "Downstairs, with Lieutenant Lagerta." "Call them now." The agent nearby reacted and quickly dialed. Within seconds, the call connected. Larry, urgency in his voice, took the phone and asked, "Lieutenant Lagerta, I need Valeria's family to answer an urgent question." On the other end of the line, a hesitant voice replied, "Hello. I'm a forensic investigator. I need to know if Valeria has a history of peanut allergies or asthma.
What?
Yes, Valeria has asthma and is allergic to peanuts.
Why are you asking?
Larry exchanged a glance with the captain, who understood immediately. Before the interrogation, Valeria had eaten peanuts. She had tried to kill herself. That's why she confessed so calmly. Get her to the hospital immediately. The captain nodded, ready to give the order, but then, inside the interrogation room, Valeria grabbed her throat. Her eyes widened in terror. She gasped. Her breathing became more labored with each passing second. Call an ambulance. Now! Captain Matthews burst into the interrogation room. Larry, on the other hand, opened his backpack, found the first aid kit, took out an adrenaline injection, and rushed into the room. As the officers unlocked Valeria's handcuffs, Larry lifted the adrenaline injection and precisely inserted the needle into the girl's leg. You won't die, not after staining your hands with the blood of 2 innocent lives. You'll live through everything you've done and face the consequences, Larry whispered coldly as he stepped away from her. She will pay. The families will get justice. And from personal experience, the real punishment isn't death, it's living with the weight of your actions. Quick, handle the girl carefully. Captain Matthews, sweating profusely, ordered the officers to take Valeria to the hospital themselves. Downstairs, Valeria's mother watched as they carried her daughter out. She kept murmuring in a daze, "What's going on? Tell me what happened. Your daughter killed 2 people. She only confessed after eating peanuts." When she realized there was no way out, she tried to escape responsibility by dying. Larry, wiping the sweat off his forehead, looked coldly at the woman and asked, "You didn't know?" Valeria's mother looked at everyone in shock, shook her head, and began to cry. Her expression was eerily similar to the innocent face Valeria had worn before, perhaps an image she had been imitating all along. Moments later, a patrol car sped away from the police station toward the ambulance. Angel walked over to Larry and muttered, "Do you want me to add that to the investigation's expense report?" "Yeah, and I also need more of these pills," Larry murmured, shaking a bottle of dubious-looking medication. "That bitch almost won," Angel muttered, referring to Valeria's attempt to take her own life. "Unfortunately for her, she won't die. I would have let her die. Now I just hope she gets the punishment she deserves." Angel never gave much thought to how a criminal ended up in prison. After spending half his day tracking down murderers, there was no point obsessing over it. As for whether the judge would be fair or not, he didn't care. Larry looked at Angel and nodded. This was how most people thought. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Larry was in the morgue, instructing Max on a minor autopsy he was performing on a hitman. Just then, the landline phone in the room rang, and Larry motioned for Max to answer it. "Put it on speaker." After listening to the message, Larry let Max finish the autopsy and stepped outside to smoke. "This will kill us slower than a bullet," Angel murmured, staring at the cigarette in his hand. "I think I'll quit." "And replace it with more donuts?" "Screw that. This is the only way a lot of people relieve stress," said a police officer who was also smoking. Once the officer left, Angel turned to Larry and updated him on Valeria's case. "Sergeant Dokes called. Valeria is out of danger. She also confessed everything about the 2 murders. Did you compare her statements with the investigation?" Larry didn't want to let a murderer slip through the cracks. Her version had to match their findings. "Yeah, don't worry. She was much more detailed this time." Looking into the distance, Angel began recounting everything to Larry, who listened in silence. According to Angel, Valeria's parents and Greta Meyer's parents were colleagues. They worked in Miami's land office and construction office. However, Valeria's father's career skyrocketed, and he quickly climbed the ranks, becoming the second in command of his department. Blinded by power and fame, he soon found himself entangled in scandalous affairs with several women. Valeria's mother, unable to endure it any longer, decided to divorce him 2 years ago. However, to avoid disrupting their daughter's life, they kept the separation a secret. Whenever Valeria came home, her parents played the role of a happy couple. But the reality was different. They lived separate lives and had long since found new lovers. Valeria, sharp as she was, had noticed everything. Perhaps she inherited her mother's talent for hiding emotions, and over time, she became her accomplice in that charade. Her life was a carefully rehearsed lie. To keep her fragile world from crumbling, she chose never to speak about it. If anyone discovered the truth, even that last illusion of normalcy would vanish. Money and power bound the parents of Valeria's group of friends together, but Greta Meyer's parents knew Valeria's parents best. One night, during a party, Greta asked a question that struck Valeria like a dagger. "Valeria, did you know your father is after a university student who was just assigned to the construction office?" Greta's voice was casual, almost a whisper, but her words hit Valeria's pride like a sledgehammer. Suddenly, she felt small. Insignificant. She looked at Greta's innocent expression, at her simple smile, and felt something dark take root inside her. Greta, Camila, and the others always enjoyed flaunting their perfect lives, as if Valeria cared. That bitch Camila was being forced by her parents to get close to a boy her age. Nicholas had no interest in her, but why reject such a useful tool? Greta Meyer, on the other hand, had always been Nicholas's protected one. Maybe in her mind, he was her pure moonlight, her untouchable love. But to Nicholas, Greta was noble, someone who should never be tainted. On the surface, Greta never showed arrogance or the need to boast, but that special treatment from Nicholas made her the most feared rival among the schoolgirls. Envy. A silent, deadly emotion. And in Valeria's heart, it had already taken root. Valeria always felt that Greta and Camila shone too brightly beside her. Their lives seemed perfect, loving families, attentive parents, and above all, a privileged place in Nicholas's heart. But when Valeria, heart-pounding, finally gathered the courage to confess her feelings to Nicholas, she was rejected. That rejection became a thorn buried deep in her soul, piercing her every time she saw her friend smile. That was when she fell ill. Doctors diagnosed her with a severe peanut allergy and over 20 other food allergies. Her fragile, tormented body forced her to rest for over a month. During that time, her relationships with her friends grew cold. The distance widened, and with it, her resentment. It was then that Valeria made a decision: Greta Meyer had to die. Of course, she had also planned to end things with Nicholas. On the day of the murder, Valeria told her family she was visiting Camila. But instead of going to her house, she found a blind spot in the surveillance, crawled under a fence, and slipped out of the gated community unseen. She then contacted her group of friends and proposed something intriguing. She told them about a meeting to plan a beach trip, a perfect excuse. Later, she cancelled the supposed meeting without telling Greta, leaving her in a vulnerable position. Excited about the gathering, Greta prepared for the night. Worried her parents might discover the lie, she preemptively told them she would be staying over at Camila's house. It wasn't the first time, so they suspected nothing. When Valeria arrived in a taxi to pick her up, Greta didn't hesitate. Together, they headed to a remote cabin, one they had gathered at more than once before. The place where everything would come to an end. Valeria played with Greta's mind. She suggested a game, hinting that perhaps Nicholas had a surprise plan for her. Consumed by the idea, Greta questioned nothing. She suspected nothing. When they arrived, Valeria blindfolded her with a silk scarf and placed a sky blue ribbon in her hands. "Just trust me." Greta, excited, nodded without hesitation. They walked through the trees. With every step, the night breeze grew colder. But Greta, trapped in her own illusion, only thought about what was to come. Maybe, after all, Nicholas was going to confess his feelings. Then, Valeria put on latex gloves and pulled a long knife from her backpack. Speaking sweetly, she wrapped the sky blue ribbon around Greta's wrists, tying it carefully. With a calculated movement, Valeria spun on her heels and, with a firm push, sent Greta crashing to the ground. She knelt on her back, pinning her down with her knees. Greta didn't understand. She only wanted to ask, why? But before she could, a knife sliced through the air, cutting Greta's cheek. The ribbon binding her wrists was severed as she tried to defend herself. The movement was so quick that Greta barely felt pain. But when the blood splattered her face and she saw the bright red on her skin, panic took hold of her. Her instinct was to scream. And she did, with all her strength. But to Valeria, that scream was more than just a sound. She felt it as a balm, something that, in a way, healed her soul. Her chest heaved with an intense, almost intoxicating emotion. Desperate, Greta twisted sharply and reached out to grab the knife. Her mind refused to accept what was happening. The same question echoed over and over, why? But Valeria didn't answer with words. She roared. She let out in a scream all the resentment and jealousy she had accumulated over the years. Greta begged for mercy, cried, pleaded, but none of it stopped Valeria. Half an hour later, Greta lay on the ground, lifeless, her body pierced by 132 stab wounds. The blood soaked the earth beneath her. But Valeria didn't feel at ease. She wanted to be sure. She slashed Greta's clothes and threw her off the cliff. Then, she plunged the blade one last time into the perineal area, waiting for a reaction. But there was none. Satisfied, Valeria meticulously cleaned the scene. She took Greta's phone and wallet and disappeared into the night. The forest, silent until then, began to fill with shadows. Wild dogs, drawn by the scent of blood, started gathering nearby. Valeria emerged from the woods unhurried. She disposed of her blood-stained clothes with surgical precision. She burned her shoes, gloves, and dress on the beach, watching as the ashes vanished into the waves. For the first time in a long while, she felt free. She found the bicycle she had hidden beforehand and pedaled home. It took her an hour and a half to return. When she arrived, her parents were waiting. "Why did you take so long?" Camila was having some trouble with math. No one suspected a thing. To them, Valeria was still the sweet and responsible girl she had always been. But the next day, the news struck like thunder. The police had found Greta's body. Camila froze when she heard. She became nervous, anxious. Something inside her told her that the story didn't add up. When she and Nicholas went to the Miami police station to see if they could learn anything, Valeria refused to go with them. Hours later, when they returned to school looking for Valeria, she was already gone. The next night, Camila couldn't hold back any longer. She called Valeria. "Tell me the truth. Do you know something? Did you cover for Greta so she could do something stupid?" On the other end of the line, Valeria sighed and lowered her voice. "Don't talk so loud. Let's meet in the school's forest, west of the library, at 4 in the morning. We'll talk there." Camila didn't hesitate. After all, what could possibly happen? Valeria was weak, a foolish girl. Could she really harm her? She arrived at the agreed place on time. The darkness of the forest was thick, almost suffocating, but she felt no fear. It was Valeria. There was no reason to be afraid. She only suspected that Valeria, being so timid, had helped Greta do something reckless and was now scared. Valeria watched her in silence and, with a shy smile, pointed at her shoes. "Camila, your shoelaces are untied." Camila looked down in confusion. Valeria took out her phone and placed it in Camila's hand, then said, "Hold this and help me with the light." Camila did so without hesitation. As she illuminated the ground, Valeria slowly crouched down. Camila had been complaining non-stop, but when she noticed Valeria's expression, an uneasy doubt crept into her mind. After a few minutes of waiting, impatience took hold of Camila. "What's wrong with you?" she asked urgently. Valeria stood up with an enigmatic smile. Well, look at yourself and tell me if your shoelaces are properly tied. Intrigued, Camila lowered her gaze to check her shoes. That was when she felt a sudden yank around her neck. Valeria, taking advantage of her distraction, had wrapped the laces around her throat and pulled with all her strength. Camila struggled desperately, her nails clawing at Valeria's arms, but she didn't relent. With a calculated move, she used her own weight to hold her down against her back. Camila's body arched, her feet lifted off the ground, and within minutes, her resistance faded. Still fearing that she might not be dead, Valeria tightened her grip until she was certain there was no sign of life left in her. With cold precision, she dragged the body to a large tree and tied it up with the same shoelaces. She positioned her in a forced stance, with her arms stretched out, forming a grotesque M. As a final touch, she removed the leather buckle from her hair and used it to cover Camila's lifeless face, hiding the frozen expression of terror. Just as she was about to light the dry branches beneath the body, a sharp cry startled her. "Hey! Who's there?" "The security guard." Without wasting a second, Valeria ran to a low wall and hid behind it, holding her breath as her heart pounded in her chest. "That's all," Angel whispered after finishing his story. Both remained silent after that. 2 lives taken out of jealousy. 2 murders committed with chilling coldness by a 16-year-old girl. 3 families shattered forever. The question weighed heavily on their minds, unanswered. Had her upbringing failed? Were her parents responsible? Or was this the result of an obsession with materialism and social competition? But no theory would bring those 2 girls back to life. Valeria turned 16 last month, Angel said, pointing out she committed 2 brutal crimes. She will likely be sentenced to life in prison. In the US legal system, minors can be tried as adults if the crime is severe enough. In a case of premeditated murder, the prosecution has the authority to request a transfer to the adult justice system. If Valeria were tried as a minor, her sentence would be limited to a juvenile detention center until she reached a certain age. But if the court considered her an adult, she could face decades in prison. Depending on the case details, even life imprisonment. Larry said nothing. He was simply waiting for the verdict. Each person must be responsible for their actions. If the truth hadn't come to light, perhaps Nicholas and even she herself would have been next. One could say they won, but in reality, that feeling never truly exists among criminal profilers. Blood Analysis Office Dexter was silent, lost in thought about the events of the past few days. This is very bad. Larry always seemed like a meticulous guy to me, but now I see him differently. He's a predator in his own game. A profiler who doesn't just analyze but dissects the minds of criminals with terrifying precision. And the worst part is, he's too close to me. His intuition is dangerous, his ability to connect patterns almost feels like a cursed gift. Before, I could maneuver in the darkness, slip through the cracks of justice. But now, with Larry actively involved in the most complex cases, I have no room for error. I can't hide information without raising suspicion. I can't divert attention without his inquisitive eyes piercing through me with that intensity that seems to see through masks. His last deduction about Valeria was an invisible yet brutal warning of his skill. He had no direct evidence at first, yet he saw what all of us overlooked. And if he can do that with just a simple photo, what will happen when he decides to focus on me? When he notices the small details that have always been there, waiting to be uncovered. For now, I must be what everyone believes I am. The blood analyst, the good coworker, the reliable Dexter. I can't make mistakes. I can't act behind Larry's back until I find a crack in his perception. I can't give him reasons to suspect because I know that once he does, he won't stop until he uncovers the truth. The problem with Larry isn't just his intelligence. It's his tenacity. His instinct. His need to hunt. And if I'm not careful, I could become his next prey. But what truly eats away at me is the powerlessness of watching those monsters he catches get locked up in cells where bureaucratic justice will handle them, or let them go on technicalities. I should be the one to eliminate them, to deliver true justice. And now, with Larry taking over every major case, my prey disappears before I can even mark them. It's an unbearable frustration. Not hunting feels like suppressing a basic need, a thirst I can't quench. And as long as Larry continues on his flawless path, my dark passenger will have nowhere to feed. "Hey, Dexter, is everything okay?" Larry asked as he packed up his things to head home. "Why do you ask?" Dexter recomposed himself and looked at Larry with interest. He definitely wouldn't fall into any psychological game he might be setting up. "If you have any problems you want to talk about, I can give you private therapy sessions at home. Just friends, nothing commercial." Larry was serious. He felt that Dexter was something he couldn't quite identify. This man hid behind many layers, like an onion. It would be interesting to discover who the real Dexter Morgan was. However, there were limits Larry would never cross. There were killers out there. Those were the ones who occupied all his thoughts and attention. Someone like Dexter wasn't significant enough to dedicate too much time to. But then again, it would be interesting to study the mind of a forensic expert who seemed to be a magnet for advising detectives with such detail, as if he were a criminal profiler himself. Maybe he is, isn't he? "I'll think about it," Dexter said with a smile. "See you later." Larry noticed that smile. It was fake, forced. The rigidity in this man was perceptible, and there was something about him that made Larry uneasy. But for now, Larry didn't know what exactly about him could unsettle a forensic expert with so many years of experience. What was really going on? "Tomorrow is bowling night, don't forget to buy a good ball." Masuka had invited Larry. After all, his relationship with the rest of the team had become closer. Larry nodded, put on his coat, it was still winter, and left the police department. Outside, Angel watched as Lagerta reviewed some documents while discussing an issue with the narcotics division. "Anything new?" Larry approached, somewhat interested in what those detectives were talking about. "Forensic Dr. Luke, seems like you still have energy to keep working," Lieutenant Lagerta said without hiding what she had in her hands. Larry's slightly tired eyes examined a dismembered corpse and said, "Was this done by some criminal gang?" "They murdered a prostitute." "The method is quite peculiar, but nothing that a Latino from a crime group wouldn't do. This is their modus operandi. Lucky she was found." "Do you want me to investigate?" Larry asked, not too interested since it didn't seem to be the work of a peculiar killer. Besides, if criminal gangs were involved, it wasn't a case that caught his attention. "Get some rest, forensic. Remember, you also have a psychology session directly administered by your former boss." Lagerta reminded Larry of his priorities. "Ah, that promise." Larry nodded, said goodbye, and headed straight to his car. "Is that the forensic expert who solved 2 cases in less than 40 hours? I heard they were very complex cases. For the homicide division, he's quite impressive." Maria Lagerta watched Larry walk away and said, "Don't be surprised, detective, but this past month he's only been giving me some headaches. He's only interested in murders that have no answers, the ones no one else can solve. He likes the heavy work." Yes, it seems that way. Larry had always tried to be someone normal, a solitary young man who adapted to the circumstances of his life. He was independent, rarely placing himself in the hands of strangers. But truth be told, his life was truly difficult. When his family was murdered by that man, he lost everything. A part of him died that night, and for a time, he felt guilty for not having died alongside them. If only he had died, would it really have been better for many people today? The criminals he had studied became his greatest obsession. He thought that if he could become a judge of death for those murderers, he might find the one who killed his family. But now, with all these years of experience, he knew he had to be patient to take, sooner or later, a revenge that must be paid in blood. "I should get some sleep." Larry muttered softly as he walked toward the elevator of the residential building where he lived. After a long time, Larry scratched his head, feeling that he was beginning to torment himself again with his own thoughts. As he was thinking of more things, the elevator doors in front of him opened. Upon exiting, he headed straight to his apartment. Once inside, he suddenly realized just how alone he truly was. "I'm home." After eating something, he decided to go straight to sleep for as long as necessary to recover. He had too many thoughts in his head, and the best way to calm himself was to sleep. For the past 15 years, Larry had been having the same dream over and over again. In it, he was the real murderer of his parents, siblings, and the life he once had. His family had been killed by a serial killer who was merely refining his skills. At the time, detectives didn't notice him until Larry secretly began studying him. Although he was also a victim, having been left alive, it could be said that his luck in not being home that night was something many would have wished for if they knew his story. But Larry hated not being there that night with his family, not sharing their pain, not bleeding alongside them. Even today, every time he falls asleep, he finds himself in his family's kitchen, where the corpses of his siblings are arranged as if for some kind of ritual. The blood-written letters on the wall, the faces of his dead family. "Why?" Larry asked, trapped in his childlike form. In this dream, he was always a weak child who couldn't even lift his hands to try to approach the murderer. "Why didn't you kill me too? What's the point of killing you for God? You are the lamb destined to wander aimlessly through the mortal world." Yes, corruption. A religious killer, blind to his own sins. Aren't you just like me? The stench of fresh blood was overpowering. For a long time, Larry had tried to adapt to this environment. This time, he had endured longer than usual, which meant he was becoming less sensitive to emotions. "I will find you." Larry growled furiously in his dream. Tears streamed from his eyes, and his fists clenched tightly. But as always, he could do nothing in this nightmare. At that moment, Larry closed his eyes and opened them in a completely different place. This time, because of the sound of the rain outside, footsteps were even harder to identify through his hearing. Even though Larry believed he possessed the divine ability to locate by sound, he was completely unable to use it at that moment. He could only curl up inside his parents' wardrobe, silently waiting for what would happen next. "Please?" Larry heard the sounds of his parents. Through the cracks in the wooden door, he watched as they were murdered. Even though he had never witnessed the killing, he hadn't even been home. Now, as a criminal profiler who had examined every detail of his family's murder, he could recreate what the killer had done. Every detail was etched into Larry's mind, the suffering of his family and how they had served as part of that murderer's ritual. "Wake up!" Larry jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, discovering he was in his bed. His breathing was ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The darkness of his room reminded him of where he had just been in his dreams. As he looked around, his previously erratic breathing began to calm. His body was soaked in sweat, his hands trembled. It had been months since he had dreamed of something so vivid and real, and now, this dream was so grim that it had shaken him deeply. Shit, 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 shit. Larry stomped on the floor with the soles of his feet. In the end, he was always alone. The rain pattered against the window, rhythmic, monotonous. In the dim light of his apartment, Larry let his memory drag him back to that night once again. The scene had changed over the years, but the pain remained intact, cold as the steel of a well-sharpened scalpel. Yes, my feelings are still the same. That man. No, that fanatic didn't understand that by leaving me alive, he gave me a purpose. He thought he had carried out the will of his God, that his ritual was complete. But no, his work remained unfinished. And I am the living proof of his imperfection. I always tried to be someone normal. The illusion of normalcy kept me sane for years, but the truth never abandoned me. Every case I studied, every profile I built, every anatomy I learned was a rehearsal for the moment I would catch that killer. I was not wrong to wait until now. If I had to kill him, I wouldn't use a gun or a blade. Those are tools of impulsive killers, of clumsy minds. A religious fanatic fears heresy more than death. I would make him face his worst fear, the desecration of his faith. I would lock him in a room where every wall was covered with altered verses, with blasphemies written in the blood of those he had killed. I wouldn't let him pray, I wouldn't give him the peace of silence. I would whisper in his ear that his God had abandoned him, that his sacrifice was in vain, that he never had a purpose. I would make him look at his reflection in a distorted mirror, where his image twisted into grotesque versions of himself. Until he could no longer bear it. Until his own faith devoured him from within. Because it's not about killing him. It's about destroying him. Taking away the only thing that sustains him. Just as he took everything from me. And when he finally falls to his knees, trembling, realizing that his God does not answer, that his prayers are empty echoes. Then, and only then, will I grant him the mercy that was denied to me. With the same coldness with which he drew those letters on the wall with my family's blood. Because revenge is not an impulsive act. It is an art. And I am its artist. Ah, damn it, it looks like I'll never get used to this. A few minutes later, Larry had managed to calm down, but his expression showed how furious he was. Somehow, he had to channel all that hatred, guilt, and fury into something, or he couldn't even imagine what he might do. Ever since he became a criminal profiler and a pathologist studying how countless murderers committed their crimes, he had discovered a bottomless iceberg of cases, some darker than others. It seemed as if humans were inherently more evil than others. There was always someone crueler. Larry sometimes wondered if murder was truly a crime or just an extension of human nature. Since the beginning of time, man has killed. No matter the era, culture, or excuse, we always find a reason to spill blood. We call some murderers and others heroes, but in the end, they all do the same thing, take lives. The Romans did it for power. An emperor could live surrounded by luxury one day and be stabbed by his own friends the next. During the French Revolution, people cheered as the guillotine fell over and over again, as if justice took the shape of a sharp blade. In World War II, millions were murdered simply because someone decided they didn't deserve to exist. History is filled with corpses, and each had its executioner. What intrigues me is not that people kill. It's that they enjoy it. Maybe if I did it, I would enjoy it too. Some do it for revenge, others for pleasure, some simply because they can. I've read serial killer profiles, and they all have one thing in common, the feeling of power. The absolute control over life and death. Some savor it, turning it into their art. But the most terrifying thing isn't them. The most terrifying thing is how easy it is to cross the line. I've seen ordinary people lose their minds in a moment of rage. An insult, a shove, a betrayal, and suddenly, someone dies. They don't even realize what they've done until they see the blood on their hands. Maybe the difference between a murderer and someone who doesn't kill is just a matter of circumstances. A bad day. A weapon within reach. A thought that turns into action before you can stop it. As for the other minority, they are just monsters. What held Larry back from becoming a judge of death was that his first victim had to be the murderer of his parents and siblings. That man had to die first, and he wouldn't kill anyone until he found him. Am I just a hypocrite? Larry asked himself. He sat on the couch and thought deeply. He decided to keep going until his body demanded and allowed it. Maybe he was a necessary evil. And now that he thought about it, he was just like all those murderers in history. At that moment, the sound of his phone rang throughout the room, pulling him from his deepest thoughts. Larry stood up and picked up the phone. Seeing that it was Jack Crawford, he put on a serious face and said, "Sir, you seem to be doing well. If you have time, you should come see me. I'll send you the address by message. We'll talk properly once you get here." "Jack, maintaining a cold tone, said this before hanging up. Jack Crawford was the head of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, tasked with investigating and capturing the most dangerous serial killers. He could easily recommend Will Graham, Larry's former professor, who had a unique ability to empathize with murderers and imagine the events at crime scenes. But to Jack, Larry was an improved version of what he could get from anyone else, someone who could easily become the greatest criminal profiler in history. That was why he wanted him in his unit. He had done everything possible to get Larry to join the FBI, but for some reason, which he now wanted to study, Larry had chosen Miami, specifically the Metropolitan Police Department. This man was very intelligent, persistent, and was the only one, besides his mentor, who knew that his true desire was to find his family's murderer. Killing him, well, Larry hadn't been very smart about hiding that during his student years. For highly observant people like Jack and Will, Larry was easy to read after interacting with him for a few weeks.
I'm glad we talked. Couldn't even say goodbye.
Larry looked at Jack's message and turned off his phone. Cafe Nostalgia, 1524, Biscayne Boulevard, Miami, Florida, 33132. Yeah, I suppose that's your style, Larry murmured as his gaze focused on the room where he kept his private investigation into the murderer he was hunting. He quickly took a shower, got dressed, and even though the meeting was at night, there was a place he wanted to visit first. Half an hour later, while Larry was eating at home, someone knocked on the door. Dexter, I didn't think you'd take my invitation seriously. Larry was surprised to see Dexter at his door after inviting him to a psychology session the day before. It wasn't common for him to offer these sessions to the public, especially because he only analyzed killers, and reflecting their abilities onto normal people wasn't the best idea. But now wasn't a good time, not after finding out that Jack was in town and having dreamed of his family's murder. Those weren't good omens, especially if he wanted to study someone like Dexter.
Did I come at a bad time?
Dexter asked, handing Larry a pie. Well, I was thinking of heading out.
Want to come?
Dexter, who was far too tense, smiled and nodded. Anything but work.
I need a break.
Then come in. As Dexter walked into Larry's apartment, his thoughts raced. I didn't refuse the psychology session.
Why would I?
Refusing would have been suspicious. Accepting it, on the other hand, made me seem open, normal, human. And if there's one thing I've perfected over the years, it's the illusion of humanity. But it seems fate has smiled upon me. Larry has other commitments. His excuse was vague, almost improvised. His eyes weren't those of someone who was simply busy but of someone hiding something. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that secrets are gateways to weakness. Larry was unsettled. His posture, his tone, the way he avoided my gaze, it wasn't just stress. It was something deeper. Guilt, maybe. Fear. Or even rage. Who does he hate? What eats away at him from the inside? And most importantly, can I use it to my advantage? I can't help but be intrigued. A criminal profiler with a dark mind. How does the world look through his eyes? How close is he to crossing the line? Investigating Larry could be interesting. Not because he's a threat, if he were, I would have noticed by now, but because if I play my cards right, I might be able to understand him. I might even be able to use him. Who knows? We might even become friends. After all, monsters need company too. Public Cemetery, Miami, Florida. Larry was indifferent to the emotions of others, but cases like Greta Myers affected him, not in a way that would mark him for life, but enough to take it personally and solve it as quickly as possible to bring some comfort to the parents. As expected, at the end of that case, all that was left for Larry was a new profile of a murderer. One who would no longer be free thanks to his smooth efforts and his imaginative mind. I wish I had caught the killer before they claimed another victim, but it wasn't my fault. Those so-called adults delayed my investigation. They were the only ones responsible for Camila's murder. This could have been avoided if I had been given time to interrogate those four students separately. If we had had time to question those kids, Camila wouldn't have been murdered, Larry told Dexter, who had followed him to the cemetery where Camila was being buried. We don't control much in life, Dexter said, glancing at Larry's indifferent expression, as if blaming someone else rather than his colleagues or himself for failing to catch Valeria in time. Yeah, you're right about that. After that meeting with Dexter, night slowly fell, and the time came to meet with Jack. RGH. The sound of the Suzuki GSX R1000 motorcycle engine roared pleasantly as Larry sped down the road. About half an hour later, he parked outside a building. At the entrance, 2 soldiers were waiting to guide him. Larry turned off the engine and removed his helmet. Larry Luke. 2 men in black suits approached him and questioned him while eyeing the weapon at his waist. Is Jack inside? Larry asked as he got off the motorcycle. Yes, but if it's not too much trouble, you need to show your identification. If you're Larry Luke, then we'll let you in, one of the men responded in a rough voice. Larry's calm eyes examined the 2 detectives, who seemed nervous. Jack was, after all, a special agent with the FBI, head of the Behavioral Science Unit. Detectives? We're not detectives, we're special agents with the FBI. That's true, but you also investigate crimes like a detective. While the term may not be entirely correct, you do almost the same thing, except you're more arrogant. Larry said, uninterested in debating the matter. Well then? Larry showed his identification, looked at the special agent, and asked, do you also want my gun? How does a forensic specialist carry a firearm? I'm also a criminal profiler, Larry replied as he was led to the room where Jack was waiting for him. Captain, he's here. Let him in. As Larry entered the room, he saw a man sitting on a couch, drinking coffee. He appeared calm, but his face silently told a different story. Save the pleasantries for when we're in public and when someone bored enough actually cares about that stuff. You know very well I don't like being compared to those old men. Jack looked at Larry with interest and said, I hope I didn't surprise you. Of course, I'm surprised. It's not common for the head of the behavioral division to be guarded by well-trained special agents, Larry said while pouring himself a cup of coffee. This place was clearly cleared of people, which meant Jack had done his job. I'm working on a very important case. Do you want to see it? Jack asked as he placed a folder on the table, stamped with a confidential seal. Larry looked at the folder and closed his eyes. It was more than obvious that Jack was trying to tempt him. This man knew that chasing special killers was his addiction. Jack, who in turn needed Larry's skills, knew that if he turned to another criminal profiler, he wouldn't get anything nearly as good as Larry. His work was clean, he didn't need evidence to trust this man. If Larry pointed at a suspect, Jack would investigate until he found them guilty. That level of trust was what Jack had in Larry, and it was also the reason he wanted him on this investigation. Is it urgent? The sooner it's resolved, the better, Jack said, not pressuring Larry for a final decision. I can't. Larry was in Miami for a very personal reason that Jack surely suspected, but at this point, he didn't care to reveal it. Larry, I need you back at the FBI. This case is exactly your specialty. If you solve it, you'll gain more than just recognition. I thought we agreed my time with the FBI was over? I'm far from all that. For now, I won't be coming back. I know, but this case is different. We have a serial killer in Chesapeake replicating illustrations of the Wound Man. Jack said as he slid the folder toward him. The Wound Man? Are you telling me someone is murdering people and posing them like in the 15th century medical engravings? Exactly. His latest victim was a mechanic, Peter Calloway. His body was found in his workshop, cut open, with multiple wounds distributed almost surgically. Clean cuts, precise punctures. Everything arranged just like in the drawings from the Fasciculus Medicinae. Larry still didn't take the folder. He thought for a moment and murmured, "Interesting." The wound man schematically displayed various wounds a person could suffer in battle or accidents. Every cut, every puncture had a purpose, to show doctors how to treat those injuries. It wasn't a symbol of terror but a manual for healing. That's correct, but this killer is using it for a different purpose. He's turning it into a map of torture, Jack said, setting his coffee cup aside. That suggests a meticulous, methodical type of killer. Probably someone with medical or anatomical knowledge. If he's truly replicating those illustrations, it means this isn't just about killing, it's about sending a message. Maybe about his own perception of life and death. "You know we need you, Larry. No one can get into this guy's head like you." Larry sighed, looked at the file, and said, "Send me everything by email, every detail. I'll coordinate with a specific agent you assign to the case. But I'm not leaving Miami, not for now." After hearing the answer he feared, Jack shook his head and looked at Larry once more. In his eyes, he could only see great determination and a desire he had never seen in him before. "Even if you had refused, it would be impossible for me to let you stay in this place forever." Jack felt that Larry's skills were being wasted here, where at most there were 1 or 2 interesting cases. "Well, this month I've handled 2 cases. Do you know about that?" Larry asked, knowing full well that Jack was his contact in the FBI and the one responsible for ensuring his psychological evaluations were taken into account. Jack nodded, pulled a notebook from his jacket, and said in a serious tone, "A murder, man in the bathtub, no traces or leads to follow." The detectives were completely stuck, which is why they called the criminal profiler I recommended to the department. In the second case, 2 murders, one after the other. Tracking the killer was so easy that you even took the liberty of sleeping. My question about all this is the following: if you knew who the killer was, why did you take so long to catch him? Jack knew Larry was far better than he had shown so far. "I need the detectives to trust me. They don't know that since my early graduation, I've never made a mistake. But they barely know me and need all the real clues a case can provide. In my department, you wouldn't need something like that, Larry." Jack wanted Larry in his department, especially because he wanted to solve all cases much faster, just as he had been doing until now. Larry's reputation was impeccable. His detailed investigations had been studied by Jack for years. Working alongside this man, the freedom Larry had in his investigations was extensive. Of course, Jack's moral code could not be violated. But when it came to investigations, that wasn't necessary, especially because there were few things that could stop Larry from pursuing a case for this man. "I'm here. You're looking for the murderer who killed your family. I suppose you're in Miami because your private investigation has led you here, and you plan to hunt him down." Jack stood up, walked toward the window, and said, "You probably want to kill him, but is it really worth it? Unless he commits a new crime and leaves some of his fingerprints behind, I won't be able to catch him. I know I'm closer than you can imagine." Larry leaned back on the couch, looking at Jack, waiting for his response. "Do you expect me to stop you? A word of advice about not killing anyone would be nice, especially from my former captain. That shit doesn't concern me. Just keep in mind that if you commit a crime, you'll be arrested." In simple words, Jack didn't seem to care about what Larry was after. All brilliant people sought strange things, but Larry didn't. He was hunting, and his prey was closer than he imagined. "How's your health?" "I manage, though I'm still taking medicine," Larry said as he looked at the file in front of him and asked, "Is this serial killer dangerous?" Jack turned around and watched Larry reading the special report he had prepared for him and said, "You studied all the cases we were involved in back when you were a student. You, more than anyone, know how to follow patterns to catch this killer. If I find a lead, I'll send it to you. But Jack, are you sure you weren't more involved in this than you should have been?" Larry asked, staring directly at Jack, who looked back at him, and both remained silent for a while. "Is that man sick, the victim, Larry? I need your help, too." Just give me time to hunt down the killer I'm after, then I'll be the hunting dog you want so badly, Larry said, closing the file. Jack, who was about to say something, received a call and said, "Well, Larry, I wish you the best of luck in your investigation. You have my number, call me if you need anything." After saying that, Jack hurried out of the room along with the soldier. Larry remained silent. Without thinking much about what he had just heard, he left the room and walked aimlessly until he reached a cemetery. After wandering for a long time, he saw a female figure standing in front of a grave. "Are you planning to attack a girl at night in a place where there's probably no one around?" Larry recognized this woman, then smiled slightly and asked, "What do you think?" "That would be a terrible idea." The woman standing in front of Larry showed the gun in her hands and asked, "What is the guy who told me to go to hell over the phone doing here after I gave him the information I worked so hard to gather for his latest case?" "I don't remember anything like that, Miss Morgan," Larry said as he looked at Deborah, Dexter's sister, who was visiting their father. "Yeah, whatever, go to hell." Larry wasn't bothered by the insult. Instead, he walked closer to Deborah and asked, "Was your father a great man?" "The best detective you could ever imagine. He taught my brother and me everything we know," Deborah said proudly, sharing the achievements her father had accomplished in the department. But she knew once again that Larry didn't care. She figured that a guy who walked alone in the most gruesome places imaginable couldn't be right in the head. What kind of criminal profiler would be? That job takes a toll on the mind, so it was likely that Larry was having problems. Setting aside her dislike for him, Deborah asked, "Where are your parents?" Larry looked at her, then glanced at the spot where she was looking. In the photo, a smiling man appeared before him. "I wish they were here. At least I could talk to them and ask if I'm on the right path." "They died too." "Not naturally. But if there's one thing that brings me some relief right now, it's that they won't be aware of the kind of person their son has become." Larry was talking more than usual. But now that he had such a special case in his hands, part of him was considering pausing the investigation into his family's killer and focusing on this one instead. In this regard, what kind of person had he become? He had undoubtedly forgotten much of his conviction. The obsession he had with killers was certainly terrifying. "I'm sorry to hear that. But if it means anything, I think being a criminal profiler that even the FBI wants in their agency says a lot about you," Deborah said. Of course, she didn't really know who Larry was, she just gave him the best compliment she could to make him feel better. "Do you want to join the homicide division? Is it that obvious?" Deborah asked with a bitter smile. That had been her biggest dream since joining the narcotics division. "It is. I can see it in your eyes. But think carefully before making that decision," Larry said. He knew that a detective's life stopped being innocent the moment they started joking around corpses. Masuka, Angel, Dexter, each of them was similar to Larry in certain ways when it came to sensitivity. "Do you think I'll listen to your words? I was just trying to be polite. It would be a shame if you lost the sparkle in your eyes, which is still intact." Larry was referring to people's innocence. Of course, for a single woman, hearing these words from an attractive man meant something entirely different. "I'm not going to sleep with you." "Wait a minute, what?" Deborah looked at Larry and said, "If you're looking for a one-night stand, find a prostitute." "Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Though that wasn't my intention, and I think I'm decent enough to win over a lady somewhere better than a cemetery," Larry said with a laugh. It was the first time in a long while that he laughed naturally. Dexter's sister was definitely entertaining. "Hey, want to grab lunch?" Larry asked, looking at her with a slight smile. Deborah shook her head, uninterested. Seeing Deborah's cold attitude, considering they were colleagues, Larry asked again with a bit more confidence. "You really don't want to eat?" "My treat." "Fine." Deborah walked over to Larry's motorcycle and got on. She was wearing long pants, a black blouse, and had a jacket draped over her shoulder. "By the way, my name is Larry." "What's yours?" Larry asked casually as he handed Deborah a helmet, even though he obviously knew her. He just wanted to make the interaction feel more formal. I know who you are. I'm Deborah. How do you know me? I just saw you in a photo my brother took with his camera. He tends to leave that stuff lying around. Larry nodded as he started the motorcycle and revved the engine. It would have been strange if this girl had decided to go eat with him without knowing who he was. Then again, few men would be interested in bothering someone like Deborah. Later, Larry was at a well-known restaurant in the area, having lunch with Deborah. Have you been here before? Larry asked, trying to start a casual conversation and get to know her a little better. No, it's my first time. What I heard from my friends is that it's pretty expensive. Is your wallet going to be okay? Larry looked at Deborah for a moment and answered with a smile. Don't worry. I said it was my treat, so order whatever you want. Thanks. Larry knew Deborah didn't have friends. At least, he could tell she had lied about that. The truth was that Deborah had wanted to visit this restaurant for a while. But since it was expensive and she felt awkward going alone, she had postponed it until Dexter had some free time. Now that Larry had shown up, Deborah took advantage of the opportunity as compensation for her contribution to the case of the murdered high school girls. Once seated at a secluded table, Deborah looked at the file in Larry's hands and asked, "Do you really need to bring that? I'm not leaving it behind." Larry wouldn't be foolish enough to leave something this important on his motorcycle, not when the risk of theft was high. If a file like this disappeared, Jack could be in serious trouble, and that wasn't something Larry would allow. A new case? Not from Miami. But let's stop talking about work, Larry said. He didn't want to involve Deborah in this investigation. Deborah, who had been thinking about it, asked, "Do you want to hear about a case I'm working on?" The prostitutes. Let's not talk about work, Larry interrupted, uninterested in what Deborah was about to say. If he learned about another serial killer now, he'd have no time left for his personal investigation outside the police department. Later, after dinner, Larry took Deborah home. Nothing happened that night. The truth was, the feeling was mutual. For now, Larry just wanted to rest, think about the case Jack had presented to him, and decide what he should do next. Killing is easy. Even a 5-year-old can take your life with a momentary lapse in attention. But what sets a killer apart is the method, an art that represents thoughts, feelings, and emotions. If the killer is intelligent, he will think through things much better than an average person. Larry immersed himself in all kinds of killer minds, from the most masterful to the most disturbed. Many kill using those feelings, and others, emotions. Needless to say, those who do it with feelings are the most dangerous. But all killers leave traces. There are many things left behind to be analyzed. Larry, holding a sword, plunged it forcefully into his target. Right now, he was recreating a series of emotions and feelings, something that could rarely be mixed in murders. On the table, a mannequin specially prepared for this test received a new wound. The killer is much more special than just a doctor. It seems he enjoys the sensations, but doesn't kill for pleasure, rather out of necessity. Larry walked toward a whiteboard and began writing down information he had arrived at with just a little observation. This killer is not only highly intelligent, but also possesses a cultural refinement that places him in the higher echelons of society. His anatomical knowledge is deep, suggesting medical or surgical training. There is a possibility that the killer has studied other serial killers and adopted elements from their methods, making it difficult to categorize him into one specific criminal typology. The variability in his murders could be seen as a form of challenge or as evidence of an evolution in his modus operandi. His ability to disappear without a trace indicates a high degree of control and an impeccable public life. He is not a conventional psychopath. His behavior reflects strategic intelligence and extreme self-control. This individual does not kill on impulse. Every murder is a masterpiece designed with a purpose we have yet to fully understand. After saying that, Larry stopped what he was doing and walked toward his landline, dialed a specific number, and once the call was connected, he asked, "This is Larry, do you have time?" "Of course, do you have something?" Jack stopped what he was doing and began recording the call. "I've been researching your case," Larry said, his eyes fixated on the experiment he had made, leading him to certain conclusions that could help Jack solve this case. Although we still don't have a specific suspect, even after analyzing the profiles of killers, the accumulation of evidence suggests that this killer has been active for much longer than you have records of and has perfected his technique. It's imperative to review unsolved homicide cases from the last 10 years to identify possible connections. The key to catching him lies in his narcissism. The perfection he seeks in his art could lead him to make a mistake. If this analysis is correct, we're dealing with a serial killer with over 30 confirmed victims over the years. The problem is, I won't be able to find out who he is while I'm in Miami. But I feel like he's there, in your circle, watching, as if he knows every move the police are making before committing his next crime. Jack, on the other end of the line, went silent for a few minutes and then asked, "Are you suggesting the killer is in my environment?" The Chesapeake Massacre killer didn't choose Peter Calloway by chance. Every move, every incision in his flesh, had a meticulous purpose, an intention beyond just murder. For him, death wasn't an act of brutality. It was a manifestation of art and knowledge. The killer, the figure behind the massacre, saw the human body as an open book, a story told through each muscle, each artery, and each bone. His fascination with the wounded man wasn't born from a desire for senseless mutilation, but from a philosophical interpretation of suffering and healing. For him, the wounded man wasn't just a medical illustration, it was a metaphor for the human condition. We were all destined to be wounded in one way or another, and only through pain did the true essence of being reveal itself. Peter Calloway was his canvas. An ordinary man, a mechanic whose only sin was his banality. The killer chose him because he represented the mundane, the predictable, the lack of a higher appreciation for life. By replicating the wounded man in his flesh, the killer gave him a new identity, turning him into something more than just a man. A symbol of human fragility, of the thin line between life and death. But this murder wasn't just a work for his own delight. It was a message. A challenge for those who would try to understand him. For the FBI agents, for the criminologists, for you, Jack, if you decide to continue investigating. The killer wants to be understood, but only by those worthy of unraveling his art. The question wasn't who his next victim would be. The question was who would be able to see him as he saw himself. Not as a killer, but as a surgeon of the soul, an artist of death. I'm not on his level. Jack, nor any criminal profiler, had seen the Chesapeake Massacre killer from that perspective. But you'll catch him, I'm sure of it. Thanks, I'll investigate. Larry, who had remained silent, closed his eyes, then opened them in the direction of his experiment and murmured, "Another one who doesn't think like I do. Could I be that unique? I don't like this place," Larry muttered as he entered the psychiatrist's office. As a criminal profiler, he needed spaces like this so his supervisors could be sure he was mentally fit to continue his work. Some of the most famous criminal profilers had retired due to mental instability, something common in this line of work. "Do you want to talk about your job?" Alessia asked, staring at Larry, who had been evading her questions as he always did. "What do you want to know? Why don't you tell me what you think about killers?" Not the best question for someone like Larry, who stood at the edge of a bottomless abyss. But since this session was about going against his analyst, he said, "They are society's mistakes. Some are born with a rotten instinct, others are shaped by the environment they grow up in. But in the end, they all make a choice to cross the line. And once they do, there's no going back. Would you say, then, that they are irredeemable?" Alessia asked as she took notes in her notebook. Larry remained silent for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, then said, "I don't care if they can change. By the time someone like me finds them, they've already done too much damage." That sounds quite deterministic. As if a killer's fate is sealed the moment they commit their first crime. I'm not interested in fate. I'm interested in justice. And your justice? Is it the law, or is it something else? That question made Larry laugh. He dreamed of becoming a judge of death, bringing justice and vengeance to those too weak to take it into their own hands. Alessia, unfazed by Larry's behavior, asked, "Did I say something funny? Let's just say the law has limits. I, on the other hand, do not. But you operate within the system as a criminal profiler. Your job is to analyze minds, not pass judgment." Alessia was confused. She didn't think Larry would be reckless enough to give such incriminating answers. "That's what my superiors believe." Larry paused and pointed out, "But when I'm working, the corpses speak to me. They scream their injustices, and I make sure their justice is served." Alessia jotted down some notes and said, "Let's get back to you. I'm interested in how your personal history affects your view on crime. It's no mystery. My family was murdered. A man broke into my house and tore them apart. How do you think that affects my view of the dozens of crimes I've solved?" Larry asked irritably, showing clear signs of anger. "It could make you develop an insatiable desire for revenge. Or it could turn you into someone obsessed with crime prevention. Where do you stand on that line?" Larry stared at Alessia and asked, "Why do you think it can't be both?" "Because revenge is personal. Prevention is objective. And you seem to mix the two." "Maybe. Or maybe I realized that to prevent others from suffering what I did, you have to take measures that others aren't willing to take." "Larry, do you think your way of thinking could lead you to act on it at some point?" Alessia thought she had hit on something. "For killers, yes. For you? Don't worry, I don't intend to harm anyone, only to catch the murderers. Tell Jack that my conviction remains the same, but my thoughts are clear, and when I take on a case, I don't rest until it's solved." Alessia, who had had this conversation with Larry before, told him, "I've already told you that our conversations are completely private. Whatever you say or don't say here won't leave this room." Larry didn't know if he could trust this woman, who had traveled all the way to Miami specifically for him, recommended by Jack, who seemed interested in seeing just how far he could go. Truth be told, Larry believed he didn't need sessions like these. They only delayed his work and his way of thinking. "Well, are we done for today?" "Yes, you can go." "And the result?" Alessia calmly closed her notebook and looked at him with an unreadable expression. "The result is that you're still fit for your job, Larry." Alessia paused before adding, "But that doesn't mean you're okay." Larry smirked mockingly and got up from his seat. "I don't need to be okay. I just need to do my job. That's what worries me." Alessia watched as he headed for the door. "Be careful with that line you say killers cross. Sometimes, when you get too close to the abyss devours you." Larry didn't respond. He just walked out of the office with the same certainty he had walked in with. These sessions were a waste of time. And here he was, at a gathering with the friends he had worked with over the past few weeks. Larry looked around, seeing familiar yet distant faces. He wasn't someone who sought out company, but after weeks of intense work, something inside him told him that maybe it was worth a try. He poured himself a drink and took a seat in a corner, listening to the conversations around him without really participating. He wasn't sure if he fit into this kind of environment, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't mind trying. "Holy hell, Masuka, what kind of horrible hat are you wearing?" Angel looked at the fish-themed cap on Masuka's head, asking in mild confusion. "Community support. I bought it from an old man at the mall. You wouldn't understand. Want a fish hat? Not a chance in hell." Masuka said nothing, simply glanced at the others and greeted them before walking over to Larry and sitting beside him. "Those guys should be here any minute." "Well, here we are." Masuka looked toward the large room next door, his eye scanning the women who caught his attention the most. "What are you looking at?" "I'm rating the best asses in the room."
I always do. Masuka responded naturally. All members of the homicide department thought similarly. After all, sex was the best part of their day. Working in this kind of department, it was common for some to have strange personalities, but among them, they understood each other perfectly. Hey, Larry, are you sure they're coming? Angel, who had heard that Larry had invited a group of detectives to play bowling, was starting to think they might not show up. Larry checked the time and said, they should be punctual, I think. Damn it, Mike, that son of a bitch drives like a maniac. The only reason I'm not kicking his ass is because we have that meeting with your psychopath friend. Marcus, dressed in sportswear, spotted Larry's group in the distance, his expression turning smug. Larry approached them, followed closely by Masuka, Angel, and Dexter. I thought you weren't coming. Are you trying to say we're scared? Marcus asked, stepping up to Larry, who simply took a small step back. Marcus, calm down. We're all friends here. Mike held back a laugh and looked at Larry apologetically. All right, get ready. We'll be over there, Masuka said as he walked away. The atmosphere in the bowling alley was charged with competitiveness and, above all, testosterone. Neon lights lit up the lanes as 80s rock played in the background. Mike Lowry and Marcus Burnett confidently walked to their area, accompanied by their captain, Conrad Howard, and 2 other detectives. A few meters away, at one of the reserved lanes, Larry, Dexter Morgan, Angel Batista, and Vince Masuka were sharpening their strategies for the detective tournament that would put the homicide division's reputation on the line. Larry tried to tell them it was just a friendly game, but no one took it that way. Look at this, we can't lose to a bunch of Miami cops who think they're kings of the law, Masuka said with a mocking grin. Of course we are, Mike exclaimed with his signature arrogance. We are the best police division Miami has ever seen. Period. Marcus rolled his eyes. Mike, relax. This isn't a raid, we're here to bowl. Angel crossed his arms. I don't see what the fuss is about. We also take down the most dangerous criminals. Well, some more than others. Captain Howard sighed and shook his head. I just want this to stay civilized. Play, have fun, and don't kill each other, leave that for the criminals. Huh? Forget about that. Marcus interrupted, grabbing a bowling ball. There's no fun without competition, Captain. We're going to show them who's boss. At that moment, Sergeant Dokes approached the group of detectives and forensic specialists, his gaze settling on the homicide division members. Crush those sons of bitches. That's the spirit, Sergeant. The tournament began, and the tension rose with every throw. Mike went first and scored a perfect strike. He raised his hands in the air and turned to the others. That's how it's done. Take notes. Marcus missed his first throw, the ball rolling straight into the gutter. Damn it. I knew this would happen. Angel took his turn and managed a spare. Not bad for my age. Dexter, with his usual neutral expression, threw the ball with precision, landing a strike. The trick is calculating the exact angle and perfect speed. James Dokes crossed his arms. Of course you'd have to analyze it like a damn psychopath, even for bowling. Masuka, with his unmistakable laugh, stepped up to throw. Watch and learn, gentlemen. He picked up the ball, made an exaggerated spin, and launched it with style, straight into the gutter. Come on, man! Marcus shouted between fits of laughter. That was the legendary Masuka's big shot. Masuka scoffed and turned away with his arms crossed. It was just a strategy to throw you off. Now comes the real shot. But on his next attempt, the ball went straight into the gutter again. Mike and James couldn't hold back their laughter. Legendary, sure, Marcus exclaimed. Masuka frowned and muttered, this loudmouth son of a bitch. What did you just say about my mom? Damn bald guy, are you a monk or a forensic scientist? Larry, who was just about to take his turn, watched as Masuka suddenly got riled up and tried to fight Marcus. Larry, a bit confused, reacted quickly and stopped Masuka. Mike, on the other hand, did the same with Marcus. Jesus Christ, I was promised this would be a friendly competition. What the hell are you doing, Marcus? Captain Conrad looked at Mike, expecting answers. This Asian guy insulted my mother, Captain. No Asian insults my mother. Marcus growled as he was dragged toward the exit. Well, I'd say that was an interesting night, Larry said, and after this disastrous gathering, he suggested they go grab a drink. Sunday, January 29th, 2006, at 2:15 p.m. Miami Metropolitan Police Department, Homicide Division. The high temperatures had started to make themselves felt in the city, reaching over 23 degrees for 3 consecutive days. At this time of year, it was the perfect opportunity for outsiders to visit Miami without experiencing extreme heat or cold. The air outside the window felt fresh, perfect for taking a walk or solving a crime. But contrary to that, inside the department, the air conditioning hummed, and the office temperature was pleasant. Captain Tom Matthews ordered Larry and his team, which had gradually solidified, to handle the identification and verification of traffic accidents over the next few weeks due to the high demand for assistance in that area. Larry, who had become the head of the formed group, and Sergeant Dokes, as the team leader, were joined by Angel as a subordinate and Max as Larry's support, with occasional help from Masuka alongside blood analyst Dexter. According to Tom, they would only serve as support for a while until a crime sophisticated enough appeared that required their intervention. That is, until the influx of tourists decreased and traffic accidents became less frequent. During their shifts, numerous forensic reports from various hospitals were issued regarding accident cases. There were bound to be errors or omissions, making it necessary to periodically review these cases to prevent unnecessary claims of medical negligence later on. Every so often, a group of dissatisfied people would arrive at the department, loudly protesting the declaration of death of their relatives, hoping that a professional forensic doctor would evaluate their injuries. This type of work was so tedious and complicated that Angel was going crazy as soon as they started being bombarded with cases. Being the only support that could be assigned due to the low number of deaths requiring their attention in recent days, unfortunately, they wouldn't be able to abandon this tedious work until a homicide case required their intervention. At present, the biggest problem the department faced was the lack of personnel. After all, not many people chose to become forensic scientists to handle these tedious tasks alongside detectives, and even those who studied this specialty often changed careers halfway through. Therefore, it remained to be seen whether they could retain the newcomers, such as Max, who had mustered the courage to continue on the team. Larry looked at the document on his computer while sitting at his desk, then read the title, Second Semester 2005 Work Summary, and frowned slightly. How was he supposed to write about his second half of the year when it had only lasted a month? Aside from the tedious meetings and cases that didn't require much attention, the second thing Larry couldn't get used to were these inevitable meetings and summary reports. What was there to summarize? How many autopsies had the pathology department performed, and how many crime scene visits had they attended this year? After all, the computer system had already compiled statistics in daily work reports and transmitted them to the higher-ups. But since this task was mandatory, Larry had spent the entire morning preparing a summary of the cases he had participated in. If he submitted the drafts as they were, they would ask him to further analyze and summarize the most important cases. However, if he included everything in the report, Masuka would definitely kill him. It's incredible. The best work rate in the homicide division has been since you started working with us extensively on cases, Masuka said while reviewing all the cases Larry was organizing. Shouldn't they already have this on hand? Masuka looked around and whispered, "This is going straight to storage, but between you and me, we're doing the logistics department's job for them. We shouldn't be wasting time on this nonsense, you should know that, boss," Larry murmured casually, trying to find out if Masuka, as the head of the pathology division, could do something to make his days less boring. Masuka puffed out his chest, looked at Larry with pride,
and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." When Masuka left, Angel, who was nearby, commented, "He's really excited." "He shouldn't be. After all, he is technically my boss," Larry said as he refocused on the document on his desk. But at that moment, the desk phone rang. It was Tom Matthews, the captain. Angel, who was busy, quickly picked up the phone. "Hello, Captain. Detective Batista, notify forensic examiner Luke. A body was found floating in an irrigation pond on the outskirts of the city. This time, they need you. Keep up the good work. We'll be there as soon as possible. Don't forget to bring the protective gear." The captain took the trouble to kindly remind them to take protective measures. This meant the scene was horrific. With this weather, it couldn't be a pleasant sight. Unlike the cases they solved in winter, now, with hotter weather, any delay could make the scene even more disastrous. Larry closed the document and looked at Angel, who had just finished the call. "Do we have a case?" Angel, who was growing tired of dealing with hospitals, nodded and said, "A body was found floating in a pond on the outskirts of the city, but still within our jurisdiction. With this temperature and the body in a pond, considering how long it's been there. Damn it, I wanted to get out of here, but not under these conditions." "That's not very reassuring," Max murmured, clearly disturbed. Larry shook his head and said, "It doesn't matter. Let's take the new masks we just received, Max." "Yeah, I'll pack them in the gear." About half an hour later, Larry, followed by Detective Batista and Max, arrived at the scene where the body had been found. The humid, sticky, and hot wind blew against everyone's faces. At that moment, the surface temperature of the exposed concrete ground outside was 73 degrees. The scorching heat felt like it was burning their airways, and the wind carried an overwhelmingly foul stench that overpowered all the officers who had cordoned off the area. That all-too-familiar sensation made Larry's nerves tingle with a strange excitement. He quickly suppressed the emotion, put on a mask, and stepped forward. With the mask on, the smell seemed much lighter. After that, Larry put on a one-piece investigation suit, layered 2 pairs of latex gloves, slipped on special crime scene boots, picked up his case, and glanced at the 2 men behind him. "It's hotter than in the department." "That doesn't matter. We need to remove this body as soon as possible, or else the stench of decomposition will spread and affect the civilians." To Larry, that scent had a name, the perfume of the dead, a detail that young forensic experts often underestimated. He crossed the security cordon with measured steps and approached the edge of the pond. The side walls were lined with stone slabs arranged at an angle of about 40 degrees to the water's surface. Only in the southeast corner was there a step descending into the water, the only visible access point. The first responders had gone down in a boat, and from below, Sergeant Dokes greeted him with a nod. Larry adjusted his gas mask, but the amplified sound of his own breathing was unsettling. He didn't like wearing it. Still, he descended the stone steps, each about 50 centimeters wide, until he reached the bottom of the pond. Sergeant Dokes, his shirt soaked with sweat, took off his mask and patted him on the shoulder. "Dr. Luke, we've got a job that excites you more than a prostitute. Give me the details." Larry ignored the vulgar remark. He knew Dokes had nothing but contempt for criminal profilers and forensic experts, seeing them as little more than undercover psychopaths. But in Larry's eyes, Dokes was no different from a killer, someone for whom deciding between life and death had become a routine in his past work. An hour ago, a local civilian, Federico, reported the discovery. Due to the recent drought, farmers had been pumping water for their flowers. The pump had been running for over an hour when he noticed that the pressure was unusually low. He went up to check and then saw it. A massive white bundle, tightly bound, floating and blocking the water outlet. The stench was suffocating. Federico stepped down a few stairs to get a better look and saw a human foot sticking out of the bundle. He panicked, backed away immediately, and called the police. Larry understood everything quickly. "I'll go down to take a look." By the way, are the forensic divers on their way? Sergeant Dokes checked his watch before answering in his usual indifferent tone. Well, you always complain when someone touches the scene before you arrive, so this time, I called you first. But don't worry, they won't take long to get here. At the same time, before Sergeant Dokes could make a call to check if the water forensics team would arrive, the sudden screech of brakes from a van was heard, and Larry knew it was them. Well, Sergeant, I'll let you do your job. I'll do mine. Larry descended the stone steps, carrying the heavy inspection case. This pond was large, about 12 meters deep. From what he had heard, this type of pond was used for wastewater detention. Retention or detention tanks are structures that temporarily store rainwater and wastewater. They are used in wastewater treatment plants to compensate for fluctuations in inflow. As he approached the water's surface, the stench of the corpse became more intense. Angel had originally wanted to stay out of it, but he also wanted to be involved in the investigation to stay informed about everything. Even though breathing with the mask on was slightly unbearable, he insisted on following Larry. Before long, he reached the water's edge. The package, wrapped in a silver-toned waterproof top, was secured with a rope tied to the side of the water pump, preventing it from drifting away. Larry assumed that the killer had clogged the water conduit locals used for their plants. In that case, it seemed like the killer wanted this to be found. Larry lifted the torn corner of the waterproof fabric and took a peek. The outer wrapping consisted of at least 2 layers of sturdy waterproof fabric. The fastening rope, a red and blue outdoor safety rope, ended in a heart-shaped loop. It was quite a strong rope, designed to withstand wear and tension without breaking easily. However, the end floating in the water had gradually loosened. Larry reached out and pulled it out. It was a sliding knot in the shape of a ring, but nothing was attached to its end. There should have been something heavy, like a rock, hanging from here. But the water pumping created a pull that separated the rope from its weight. That allowed the body to be sucked in. The corpse's feet had swollen and deformed to the point where the outer skin looked like a casing over the muscle. Larry barely lifted one end of the waterproof fabric, and the stench immediately intensified. As he examined the state of the ropes, he paused for a moment, analyzing the details. Angel, get this body moved as soon as possible. Also, tell the forensic divers to search the water thoroughly. Any finding, no matter how insignificant it seems, I want it photographed and secured in an evidence bag. Without waiting for a response, Larry walked away from the scene, immersed in his own conclusions. Angel had years of experience in the field. He had worked on countless cases involving bodies carried away by the current, whether in rivers, the sea, or even on highways. He knew exactly how to act and which procedures to follow. After all, this was Miami. In Florida, especially in the southeast, a coastal city like this often witnessed people, whether out of desperation or intoxication, throwing themselves into the sea or rivers. If he could, Angel would do everything possible to raise awareness about an often overlooked fact: bodies that emerge from the water are usually found in a horrifying state. If anyone were considering that way of dying, they would definitely change their mind. However, it was rare to find a corpse so decomposed that it became a giant vision. Even without Larry saying it, Angel was certain that this was not the only crime scene. Clues underwater awaited the forensic divers. Angel nodded, suppressing the urge to vomit as he tried to maintain his composure. I'll go get someone. By the way, Larry, I'll send you 2 photos of tire tracks later. They were found on the grass near the pond 5 to 7 days ago. Sergeant Dokes watched as the divers prepared to inspect the bottom of the pond while Larry finished his initial assessment of the scene. He had already helped contact the morgue's body transport vehicle. After all, not many were willing to do that job. Regardless of how the body was wrapped, the vehicle would be unusable for at least a week. The stench of a corpse can permeate everything, and there's no escaping the smell. Without hesitation, Larry approached Sergeant Dokes and handed him a brief report. Sergeant, this seems to be the spot where the body was dumped. At first glance, there aren't many pieces of evidence we can collect. It's also unlikely that the divers will find much more, though it's crucial that they inspect every detail. If they find anything, no matter how small, I want to be informed immediately. As for the photographs, we must handle them with complete transparency." Dokes nodded firmly. "Don't worry, I'll attend the autopsy later. Let me know as soon as you find anything that might help us in the investigation." Larry nodded, removed his gloves after taking off his one-piece suit, and was quickly taken to the morgue, following the truck transporting the body. "A little vapor rub will do the trick. The menthol in the ointment will get rid of the bad smell in your nose. It'll be uncomfortable and sting a little, but it's much better than having the stench of the corpse stuck in there." Vapor rub is an ointment or inhaler used to relieve nasal congestion, cough, and muscle pain. But Larry used it on his nose. It was a habit, almost an addiction, that he liked to indulge in. "This feels so much better," Angel said after applying it to his nose. Once they arrived at the department, the morgue transporters took less than 5 minutes to unload the body and send it to the autopsy room, a space specifically designed for highly decomposed corpses. The staff in the lobby opened all the front and rear doors, turning on the filters in the hopes of quickly dispersing the odor. Even though the disinfection and air extraction system in the dissection room was extremely advanced, the smell was still unbearable. Before getting out of the car, Max put on a mask, picked up a DSLR camera, and meticulously photographed the outer packaging along with the knot securing the corpse. Angel, on the other hand, jotted down any details that might aid in the investigation. At that moment, after putting on his special work suit, Larry lowered the room's temperature as much as possible and returned to the dissection table. He cut the rope and carefully removed the waterproof fabric wrapped around the body, following the folds of the package. Only when the outermost layer of silver-white waterproof fabric was removed did Larry uncover the secret. "Am I mistaken, or is this like a tent?" Angel agreed and said, "Let me see if there's a brand logo." As he spoke, Angel spread out the waterproof fabric from the outer packaging onto a nearby operating table and began inspecting it carefully. Unfortunately, all the edges of the top had been cut, and its size and shape were perfect for wrapping the body. Angel furrowed his brows in frustration but refused to give up. After spraying a reagent inside the waterproof fabric, several palm and incomplete fingerprints gradually appeared around it. Though they weren't clear enough, it was still a breakthrough that made Angel extremely pleased. While he was busy with this, Larry had already removed the second layer of waterproof fabric. The moment it was taken off, Angel, who had a high tolerance for corpses, felt a wave of nausea. No type of mask could fully block out the stench. No matter how good the ventilation was, the smell was unbearable. "Max, increase the filtration speed." "On it." Max walked over to a wall-mounted control panel and adjusted the filter settings. Angel acted quickly, capturing several detailed photos of the body. It was then that they all noticed the deceased's attire. A man dressed in a mid-season black shirt, a royal blue turtleneck sweater, and matching autumn pants, along with black hiking trousers. His belt was broken, and his shirt had been bunched up to his armpits. His pants were torn, and his grotesquely swollen abdomen was crisscrossed with dark green veins, stretched tight as if the body was on the verge of bursting. Larry, unfazed, worked alongside Max to remove the deceased's clothing. However, as soon as Max touched the body, a shiver ran down his spine. The corpse's skin was covered in a viscous layer of decomposed fat, slippery and soft. With the slightest pressure, a piece of flesh detached effortlessly, revealing the frailty of the tissue in its advanced state of decay. Larry leaned over the body, meticulously analyzing every detail while instructing Max to take notes. Male, approximately 1.75 meters tall. No visible documentation or identification. No apparent external injuries on the body's surface. The stains on the limbs were distinct and well-defined. However, on the deceased's right groin, Larry found a scar. Probably from a childhood surgery. "From what I can see, he also had a hernia operation less than 5 years ago," he muttered while writing it down. Additionally,
The body has some letters tattooed on the skin. The man's eyes were wide open, his tongue protruding, and his mouth and nose were obstructed by remnants of vomit. The corpse was in an advanced state of decomposition. Currently, daytime temperatures could reach 40 degrees Celsius, with nighttime lows not dropping below 20. The water, though slightly cooler, had accelerated the body's decay. Larry estimated quickly, the body was in the water for about 5 to 7 days. Max paused briefly, reflecting on the accuracy of the analysis. Larry was referring to the time the body had been submerged, not the exact time of death. Without lifting his gaze, Larry continued, based on the average temperature in the southeast and the deceased's clothing, his death occurred at the end of winter or the beginning of spring, or perhaps in late autumn or early winter. Angel furrowed his brows and asked, "Are you saying the body was frozen? That it was only dumped in this pond 5 to 7 days ago?" Larry paused for a moment before suggesting firmly, "Based on the estimated time, we can adjust the investigation line and reduce the margin of error. This pond is in a fairly isolated location. Yes, if you're not a local or someone who knows the area well, it would be difficult to find this place," Angel affirmed, observing the surroundings. Larry nodded and crossed his arms. "The choice of the killer is interesting. They could have hidden the body in a more accessible place, but instead, they threw it far from any housing or obvious landmarks. That indicates they didn't want the body to be found easily, but they weren't familiar with the area. Maybe they thought we would never find it." At that moment, Angel leaned over the body and used a magnifying glass to inspect a mark on the inside of the victim's neckcloth, then asked, "Can we get any information if we analyze their clothing?" Max, who had a good eye for fashion, examined the sweater carefully. "It's a spring model, I've seen it before. It costs around $400. I don't recognize the logo. Also, it's not common to see this kind of clothing in Miami. The suffocating heat of the city made it unlikely that anyone would wear a thick sweater for long, unless they weren't used to the climate." Larry leaned in and looked closer at the label. "This is French, look at the E with the umlaut. If the victim was wearing this sweater, they likely had a good economic status. That leaves us with two possibilities: either they recently traveled and bought it in another country, or they were foreign. Either way, it complicates identification." Larry waved his hand to signal the others to step away, while his thoughts focused on reconstructing the victim's profile. The scalpel in Larry's hand slid with surgical precision over the victim's abdomen, and as the skin and tissue separated, an unbearable stench filled the autopsy room. Angel instinctively stepped back, covering his nose. The putrid odor of decomposition hit him so intensely that he felt his stomach churn. "I can't," Angel murmured before quickly turning and leaving the room. Max and Larry, more accustomed to these situations, moved to one of the air extractors, where the foul smell was slightly more tolerable. About 10 minutes passed before everyone returned to continue with the autopsy. "I'm sorry, just now." Angel apologized, still looking a bit pale. "It's okay, it's a normal human reaction," Larry replied indifferently, waving his hand to downplay it. Then, without wasting any more time, he resumed the dissection. He examined the victim's larynx and neck, but found no signs of strangulation. There were no fractures in the thyroid cartilage or hyoid bone. Everything indicated that the cause of death wasn't mechanical asphyxiation. When he opened the trachea, he discovered a significant amount of thick foam blocking the airways. "Drowning liquid," Larry murmured, frowning. Then, his hand paused for a moment over the lifeless body. Something didn't add up. His intuition told him that the victim had been murdered before being thrown into the pond. From the rigidity and state of the body, he strongly suspected that the body had been frozen before being abandoned. But the presence of drowning liquid in the lungs confused him. If they died before falling into the water, how is this possible, he thought, feeling like the key piece of the puzzle was still out of reach. They examined the lungs. Pulmonary edema was evident, and they were saturated with foam, a finding characteristic of death by drowning. However, there was something else in the picture that felt unsettling. They took samples of the lung tissue and extracted intracardiac blood, handing them to Max for analysis. "I want a full toxicology report," Larry ordered. He was still a little confused that his instincts were wrong with the real data. Meanwhile, the examination of the digestive tract revealed that, due to the advanced state of putrefaction, there were no signs of drowning in that area. As expected, the stomach contents had been expelled through the mouth due to the gases generated in the decomposition process. Before finishing, they photographed a surgical scar on the victim's abdomen, indicative of a previous hernia surgery. Larry stepped back, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. There were too many loose pieces in this case, and his instincts told him that the answer was closer than it seemed. Larry made a lateral incision with precision. Despite the severe decomposition in the abdominal cavity, his trained eye soon detected something unusual, a wavy surgical mesh attached to the deceased's groin. Carefully, he removed it and rinsed it before placing it under the high-powered magnifying glass. He frowned as he analyzed the structure of the implant. This isn't a regular patch. The size was considerably larger than usual. Judging by the texture and pattern of its surface, it appeared to be an expanded polytetrafluoroethylene patch. They were only used in severe hernia surgeries or cases requiring reinforced repair. To confirm his hypothesis, he asked the other forensic experts to help turn the body. The sticky touch of the decomposing skin was an unpleasant sensation, but it wasn't the first time Larry dealt with it. Not everyone shared his resilience. Some technicians barely managed to hold back their nausea and left the room again. However, Larry remained steadfast. Something caught his attention. Behind the deceased's ears, just beneath the skin, there were two spots of a dark green color, subtle but noticeable. Max, photograph these areas. The flashes lit up the room as Max captured the images. Larry glanced at his team. They were at their limit. The stench, the grotesque sight of the decomposition, and the tension of the autopsy were wearing on everyone. But the final step remained. The brain. The very thought of opening that swollen and deformed skull was unpleasant even for him. He took 2 deep breaths, adjusted his posture, and slid his gloved fingers over the head of the corpse, feeling the soft and putrefied texture of the scalp. All right, let's continue with this.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.